Chapter 1062, Teaching. Online. Klein glanced at Leonard and smiled. The targets aren't demigods. They've only lived to this day due to some sort of influence. This is also the secret I wish to discover through dreams. He deliberately emphasized the word lived. Without waiting for Leonard to respond, Klein continued, the aristocrat from the fourth epoch is a member of the Zoroast family. You might be able to use his dream to learn more about Palaz Zoroast. Old man's descendant. Leonard's heart stirred as he looked forward to the proposal that Klein raised. Although he had gotten along rather well with Palaz Zoroast and gradually built some trust in this angel, he still held the most basic level of vigilance against him. After all, he was an outsider who lived in his body. At that moment, Klein added, for now, don't mention this matter to Palaz Zoroast. Do you think I'm such an unreliable person? Leonard grumbled inwardly as he replied, there's no need to remind me. Seeing that Leonard had agreed, Klein smiled and said, get me a few drops of your blood when you return. This is necessary to explore the dreams. He didn't specifically mention how to give the blood to him. After all, Leonard knew at least two methods. Firstly, he could sacrifice it to Mr. Fool and request that he bestow it to the world. The other was to summon the messenger of mysterious origins and place the blood inside a bottle, sending it over with a letter. Blood, Leonard subconsciously repeated the word. In mysticism, one's blood was an important item. It was best not to give one's blood to others, otherwise, they might die without knowing the reason. Sometimes, death wasn't the most terrifying outcome that could happen. After a brief moment of hesitation, Leonard nodded. When will the exploration begin? Klein was prepared for this question as he replied, late Sunday night, close to midnight. He wanted to give Miss Justice time to converge her spirituality and familiarize herself with her abilities. All right. Leonard didn't say anything else. Following that, Klein seriously explained skills in sophistry so that the dear poet knew how to pacify his grandpa after returning. After returning to the real world, Leonard was deliberating over his words when he heard Palaz Zoroast's slightly aged voice. Why did your former colleague look for you? Is there anything that cannot be explained in a letter? Leonard adjusted his sitting posture and chuckled. He's afraid that the letter will be leaked. After all, it might involve that person. Just as he finished his sentence, Leonard inwardly mumbled, of course, the most important thing is to be wary of you. What I see is equivalent to what you see. That person, Palaz Zoroast, seemed to understand who he was referring to. Yeah. Leonard picked up a cup on the table and drank a mouthful of malt beer. He found an ascetic from the third epoch. He hopes to learn the history of that epoch through his dream. What Leonard said was the truth, but it was only a portion of the truth. This was the skill that Klein had specially taught him. An ascetic from the third epoch? He's still alive? Palaz Zoroast asked in surprise. Of course, he wasn't too surprised. After all, at his level, even if he didn't grasp 100 methods that allowed people to live from the third epoch, he knew at least 5 or 6 methods. The easiest way was to steal the time or life of others to imbue it into a target. He's likely still alive, but has a very special condition. Leonard explained what he knew. Palaz Zoroast fell silent for 2 seconds before saying with a chuckle, is that so? Then I can only wish you the best in not seeing scenes you shouldn't see in the dream. Of course, your former colleague is protected by an existence of concealment, so he must be prepared. Leonard didn't respond to the topic. He suddenly exclaimed, old man, are you actually not the least bit curious? Don't you want to know what the true deities were like in the third epoch, or the cause of the cataclysm? This was the second technique in sophistry that Klein taught him. Rather than being asked, it was better to take the initiative to ask questions. I can roughly guess what's going on, Palaz Zoroast replied with a sigh. He then scoffed. You took too much initiative to control the flow of our conversation today. This is very different from your past behavior. This means that you have a secret you're hiding deep down. Not bad, it's much better than the past. At least it's not something that can be seen through at once. Leonard's expression froze. Palez immediately chuckled. See, I just gave it a try and you exposed yourself. You still lack training. Your former colleague is really... TSK, Leonard could only respond with a dry chuckle. He put down his cup and leaned forward. He then picked up a silver ritual dagger and cut open a wound, causing a few drops of blood to drip out. Meanwhile at Earl Hall's residence, Audrey was also holding a dagger with gems embedded in it. She was preparing to fulfill the promise of providing help for free. She moved the tip of the dagger towards the back of her hand. The pain is very mild. The pain is very mild. As she hypnotized herself, she exerted force and tore open a wound. It was currently impossible to tear her skin without using strength, even if she didn't reveal her dragon scales. On Sunday night, after attending a ball, Klein returned to 160 Buckland Street. He made up an excuse that he was feeling tired and needed to sleep early. In the wee hours of the night, he got out of bed, set up a ritual, and summoned himself. After some work, he sat in the seat that belonged to the World Gehrman Sparrow. He confirmed that once the summoning ended, he could use the grey fog's level and standing to forcefully extricate himself from Grozel's travels. At that moment, in front of him were 3 metal bottles and a silver mask. The former was filled with his, Leonard's, and Audrey's blood, while the latter was sacrificed by Miss Justice ahead of time. As she knew that Mr. Starr would be involved in the exploration of the dream this time, she planned on wearing lie the entire time to mask her face and avoid her identity from being uncovered. After examining it for a while, Klein made the hard-covered, deep brown Grozel's travels to fly out of the junk pile and land on the long bronze table. At the same time, he placed the unshadowed crucifix into his body. Following that, he pulled Justice Audrey and the Star Leonard above the grey fog. 2 dark red beams shot up at the same time, forming rather blurry figures. Audrey and Leonard cast their gazes at the bottom of the long, model table and sized up the items in front of Mr. World. Then, their attention was drawn to the ancient book. Audrey's eyes darted around as she curiously asked, "Our exploration this time is related to this book?" "Yes, our targets are inside this book," Klein replied with a smile. "Inside the book?" Leonard asked in surprise. Even though he was a Red Glove, and had also read a large number of supernatural case files, he had never heard of communicating with characters in a book. Klein nodded slightly and said, "Yes, this is a magical book. Inside it, there is a world that was envisioned. What happens in that world becomes the book's contents." Envisioned? Audrey acutely grasped a key phrase, linking it to its synonyms. She had only just learned a few days ago from Mr. World that the Spectator Pathways Sequence 0 was called Visionary, and she knew very well that the King of Dragons, the ancient god, Ankwelt, was the dragon of imagination. After some deliberation, Klein said, "My description might not be accurate. It might be an envisioned world or a true dream. The only thing I can confirm is that it was created by an ancient god from the second epoch, the dragon of imagination Ankwelt. I obtained it from Vice Admiral Iceberg. Ancient god's relic. It's no wonder that it can make a giant and elf from the second epoch, a third epoch ascetic, a fourth epoch human aristocrat, and fifth epoch Loanese soldier survive till now." Leonard came to a realization as he couldn't help but size up the World Gehrman Sparrow. He couldn't imagine what kind of experiences Klein had ever since he left Tingen. At this moment, Klein looked around and pushed the lie mask to Miss Justice as he said, "Let's head on in." "All right." Audrey put on the silver mask. Leonard looked around and nodded. "Okay." Klein immediately picked up the 3 metal bottles and poured out some of the blood inside, smearing it on the cover of Grozel's Travels. So this is what the blood was for. Just as this thought flashed through Audrey's mind, she saw a white snowy storm. Amidst snowflakes the size of down feathers and a biting cold wind, a city that was more than 15 meters tall stood nearby. A soldier wearing leather armor on guard by the gates was huddled in a spot that was immune to the wind and snow. As long as there weren't any merchant convoys, he wouldn't head forward to block any ordinary pedestrians. This is a world that was completely envisioned. It's like it's real. Leonard looked around as he spread out his palm and caught several snowflakes. He felt the coldness of its touch before they quickly melted into water. After confirming the environment, Leonard suddenly realized something. Klein was maintaining the image of the cold and refined German sparrow. Miss Justice wore a silver mask, revealing the bottom of her face, green eyes, and blonde hair, making it impossible to imagine her actual appearance. As for himself, he didn't disguise himself at all. This was a habit of official Beyonders. They openly carried out missions without any disguises. Mr. Starr really is laid back, and his hair is combed very casually. It's such a pity. Otherwise, with his looks, he can be a model on the covers of magazines. As a noble lady who had seen too many handsome men, Audrey politely glanced at him before retracting her gaze without making any excessive observations. Klein chuckled inwardly and pointed at the city in the snowstorm. Our first target is the ascetic, Mr. Snowman, from the third epoch. This was the person most likely to have a link to Amon and his brother. According to Klein's plan, after Snowman would be the fourth-generation aristocrat, Mobit. This was because giant Grozel and elf Ciatas involved matters at much higher levels, and there was a high chance of there being an accident. Therefore, it was safer leaving them at the end of the schedule. After the exploration of the four people's subconscious via their dreams, they would then enter the sea of collective subconscious in search of any possible secrets. Chapter 1063 The Lord's Left Hand. In a rather remote spot in Pesot City, there was a building made of stone. It looked rough and was a cathedral that needed some construction work. The most eye-catching and intricate part was the altar. Erected over it was a wooden cross and a tall figure carrying the cross. Ascetic Snowman was sitting in the first pew, facing the divine statue, his head bowed and his eyes closed in focused supplication. He was a middle-aged man who wasn't considered old but had some wrinkles. He was wearing a simple white robe that had been washed countless times. He had brown short hair, and on his exposed arms, shoulders, calves, and feet, there were all kinds of old scars and scabs. At that moment, two men and a woman appeared at the cathedral entrance. The men were dressed in black robes that were completely different from the surroundings. One was wearing a vest and half-top hat with a formal bow tie, and the other casually wore a white shirt. The former had a pronounced outline with a cold expression, while the latter had black hair and green eyes. He looked pretty good, exuding the romantic air of a poet. The lady was wearing a long white dress that was tight at the waist with frilly designs at the sleeves. Lacy flowers were sewn in a meshed manner at her chest. She wore an intricate silver mask, revealing a pair of emerald-like eyes, her high nose, her lip-glossed lips, and lower half of her face. It prompted anyone who laid their eyes on her to imagine how beautiful her actual appearance was. They were extremely attractive. It was the same regardless of the angle one took. However, the passers-by, and few members of the congregation, and the praying ascetic didn't even give them a look, completely ignoring them. This was a combination of hallucination and psychological invisibility. Audrey was already in operation mode, no longer showing any curiosity. She swept her gaze and said in a gentle voice, "What's most important now is to get Mr. Snowman to sleep, otherwise, we'll have to wait until tonight. The night in this world. Relax. It's trivial," Leonard replied with a smile. Compared to Miss Justice, who had only experienced a few supernatural incidents, as a Nighthawk, he was already too used to such things. He was very composed and even wanted to joke with Klein. Of course, he didn't know that Miss Justice had recently hypnotized a demigod. Klein glanced at his former teammate. Then let's begin. He was carrying unshadowed crucifix on him, and in less than 3 hours, he would be dropped back to sequence 5 and have his bizarro sorcerer beyonder characteristic purged, so he naturally didn't want to waste any time. He's back in his crazy adventurer state again. TSK. Leonard didn't beat around the bush. He raised his hand to neaten up his hair as his green eyes suddenly turned deep. Silently, the praying ascetic, Snowman, had fallen into a deep sleep. This is the beyonder power of a nightmare. Looking at this scene with sparkling eyes, Audrey thoughtfully muttered to herself. In fact, she was aware of the powers of a nightmare, having seen them in action before, back when they were dealing with the sanguine Viscount, Ernst Boyar. However, she was unable to grasp the full picture of it due to the urgency of the situation. It was only now that she made a complete observation of it. Right on the heels of that, she raised both her hands and grabbed the arms of the world and the star. Using her abilities of Dreamwalker, she led them into Snowman's dreamscape. I can do it myself, Leonard mumbled the moment he entered the hazy world. Klein and Audrey ignored him and quickly surveyed the area, taking in the entirety of Snowman's dreamscape. They were also inside a cathedral, an unusually majestic cathedral. Ancient stone pillars propped up a towering dome, but they didn't make the hall appear too segmented and cramped. It still remained extremely spacious. The cathedral's door was wide and tall, even for giants. Lined on both sides were candles placed in silver cups that emitted a warm glow. The altar right in front was grand and magnificent. Above them were grayish-white crosses and a sculpture of God bearing the cross. The statue's face wasn't very clear, but it felt like it was showing pity towards all beings in the world. Snowman was similarly sitting in the first pew facing the holy altar. His head was bowed and his eyes closed in focused supplication. This is similar to the afternoon town's abandoned cathedral that Little Sun showed to us. It should be a building from the same era. Audrey swept her gaze across the brick arches and whispered. At the same time, she tried to suppress her curiosity and told herself to remain calm. Little Sun? How is he little? That fellow is clearly taller and larger than me. Afternoon town's abandoned cathedral. Leonard thought in puzzlement as he lampooned. When he joined the Tarot Club, the son Derek had long returned to the City of Silver. Although he would occasionally mention the exploration of the Giant King's court, he didn't conjure any of the corresponding images. Indeed. Klein retracted his gaze and agreed with Miss Justice. Then, he said to her, try to guide Snowman's dream and get him to reveal the important information in his subconscious. Focus it on the kings of angels. This mission could be accomplished by both a nightmare and dreamwalker. The reason why he had Miss Justice do it was because he wanted to give her a chance to digest the dreamwalker potion. After all, Leonard had already passed that stage. And no matter what, in matters that involved the subconscious, beyonders of the spectator pathway were definitely more professional. The way they carried it out would be more precise and effective. It was only then that Leonard realized a problem. Miss Justice's abilities involved the domain of dreams. This meant that she had already advanced to sequence 5 Dreamwalker. Isn't that too fast? Leonard was secretly surprised and in disbelief. He remembered that Miss Justice had mentioned it during their exchange when he joined the Tarot Club. It hadn't even been a month since she became a hypnotist, and now, only 3 months had passed. She had indeed tried to purchase the ingredients needed for her advancement at the tarot gathering, but to completely digest the hypnotist potion in 4 months is shocking enough. Leonard's mind raced as he had a baffling feeling that the pride of becoming a Red Gloves captain, a quasi-high-ranking member of the church, a Sequence 5 spirit warlock was gone. While his thoughts were running wild, Audrey tersely acknowledged the request and took a few steps forward to stand beside Snowman. Illusory ripples suddenly appeared in her jewel-like eyes. Those ripples constantly sank deep into the depths, returning to the darkness and tranquility. Invisible ripples emanated out as the altar in front of the cathedral suddenly turned blurry. These magnificent objects, along with the cross and the divine statue, warped and suddenly unfurled, emitting lights and shadows that weren't considered too intense. The light and shadows intertwined into a three-dimensional portrait of a towering mountain range. The main peak reached high into the clouds, but the white cloud didn't dare to conceal the main peak as it automatically separated around the peak's two sides. On the peak of the mountain stood a huge cross that was even taller than the mountain. In front of it stood a majestic figure that was covered in layers of stacked halos. 2-winged, 4-winged, and 6-winged angels were either holding bugles, playing the harp, or playing flutes, dancing around the majestic figure as they sang and extolled. 8 blurry figures with 12 pairs of wings surrounded the majestic deity. Some fell to the ground beside his feet, leaning against him as if completely relying on him. Others floated on both sides, awaiting his orders. This was a scene that Klein had seen before. He knew that the deity was the ancient sun god, and he knew that the figures with 12 pairs of wings on their backs were the kings of angels. At that moment, Snowman opened his eyes and looked at Justice Audrey. As if teaching his student, he solemnly said, "Only the Holy Spirit can truly serve the Lord. This is the goal I've been chasing my entire life. I see the Lord standing above the infinite radiance, benevolence scattering over his kingdom and the land. Around him are 8 kings. The dark angel was the first angel created by the Lord. He is his left hand, his proxy and the deputy of heaven. The angel of imagination is the Lord's eldest son. The Lord said that in a distant future, you will become the savior of all life. The angel of time is the Lord's second son. The Lord said that you are a god of trickery and a god of mischief, the light at the dawn of the apocalypse. The white angel, wind angel, and angel of fate are loyal followers of the Lord, firm, brave, honest, having been that way from the time when they were weak till they became strong. The wisdom angel was sanctified due to his redemption from being penitent and contrite, completely opposite from the ones who fell after eating the fruit of sin. The war angel is the Lord's rage, the Lord's punishment. His appearance over the land means war is at hand. From the looks of it, this ascetic has never been to the ancient sun god's divine kingdom, nor has he ever seen a king of angel. What he's describing is probably from religious canon. In other words, what he says is what the official text says. From the looks of it, Dark Angel Sasser was really the leader of the kings of angels. He was most trusted by the ancient sun god and was called the deputy of heaven. Yet, such an existence was bewitched. I wonder what his outcome was in the end, and why there aren't any traces of him to date. Klein seriously listened to Snowman's description and had a clearer understanding of the kings of angels. He never expected that the ancient sun god would predict that Adam would be the savior. This left him somewhat puzzled. So these are all the 8 kings of angels. Leonard listened attentively as well. This was something that old man Palaz hadn't told him in detail before. It was a real secret from ancient times, something that happened before the cataclysm. Audrey had seen the mural of the 3 kings of angels eating the city of Silver Creator. Through the corresponding images, she had matched them to the eternal blazing sun, the Lord of storms, and the God of knowledge and wisdom, so she wasn't too surprised. She turned her head and looked at the world and the star, calmly interpreting the hidden meaning behind those sentences. According to what Mr. Snowman said, the Dark Angel was created. The 3 kings of angels, White, Wind, and Fate, had followed the ancient sun god from a weak stage until they slowly empowered themselves. The weak stage here probably refers to sequence 4. The wisdom angel should be an outsider who joined later, and he might have been from an opposing faction in the beginning. When he heard Miss Justice's words, Klein suddenly remembered a name. It was the Dragon of Wisdom as mentioned in the City of Silver's myths Haraburgen. He then nodded, indicating for Miss Justice to continue. After Snowman recited some related scriptures, he suddenly solemnly said, "Our diocese has cultists who believe in the Evernight hiding within it. These are the orders from the kings." Chapter 1064 Drawing Closer Cultists who believe in the Evernight. Upon hearing Snowman's words, the three present were more or less thrown into an awkward situation. Klein, Audrey, and Leonard all had a certain relationship with the Evernight goddess. One was a standard cultist who believed in the Evernight. The other wasn't only a cultist, but a quasi-high-ranking member of the cult, an elite team leader. The other was even worse, a blessed of the evil goddess. Ahem. From the looks of it, the Church of Evernight appeared earlier than what the historical records stated. They can be traced back to a long time before the Cataclysm. However, it existed in the form of a secret organization. Klein cleared his throat and did a simple analysis, breaking the sudden silent mood. Audrey pursed her lips and nodded. She continued guiding Snowman's dreams, letting him reveal the information related to the King of Angels in his subconscious. Unfortunately, Snowman was only a Sequence 5 ascetic. He would be considered a quasi-high-ranking member in the Fifth Epoch and would be able to come into contact with several important figures and historical secrets. However, before the Cataclysm, a Sequence 5 didn't enjoy such a status. He wasn't even able to enter the Divine Kingdom, so he naturally knew little about the kings of angels and the ancient sun god. What he knew was limited to what was written in the various religious canons. However, Klein keenly noticed that he had mentioned something. There were traces of the remnant giants in the northern Ridge mountain range. This mountain range's present name was Antares, and it was located within Faysac. It made it easy for him to associate this information with the people of Faysac claiming to be descendants of giants, how the god of combat was a giant, and other information. Seeing that there was no connection to the kings of angels, Audrey switched to guiding Snowman's dream into presenting what was most important and influential to him. The majestic cathedral they were standing in began to shake as changes silently happened. In just a few seconds, the cathedral's scale shrank. Outside was a square that had been renovated. Snowman knelt in front of the cross and divine statue, his body bathed in pure sunlight. A blurry figure in simple priest robes appeared beside him, speaking with a loud and solemn tone. "Are you willing to choose the path of an ascetic, to give up love, to distance yourself from indulgence, to not wield power, to train your mind, and to temper your mind, allowing you to approach our Lord by entering heaven one step at a time?" Snowman devotedly kissed the ground and said, "I'm willing to choose the path of the ascetic. I'll give up love, distance myself from indulgence, not wield power, train my mind, and to serve the Lord. It will be so forever and ever from this day forth. It will be so forever and ever from this day forth." The more Snowman spoke, the more resolute he became. In the end, he solemnly repeated his promise. This is the one thing that left the deepest impression on him and has resulted in the deepest effects on him. Audrey turned her head and said to the world and the star. Thinking back on Snowman's past performance and recalling how he never gave up on his beliefs, nor stopped his ascetic training despite being stuck in the book world, Klein nodded gently inside. He is a true ascetic. Audrey retracted her gaze, and after guiding Snowman to present something that was more important to him, she returned to the world and the star and said in a gentle voice, "There shouldn't be much left." Klein glanced at Snowman and said, "Let's go to the next spot." Inside a house in Pesot City. Mobit, with his brownish-yellow hair, dark brown eyes, high nose bridge, and thin lips, was wearing slightly furry pajamas. He laid on a bed that was half high and half low, as he stared at the ceiling, muttering to himself, "Winter year is much colder than usual. It's starting to snow. Although it's almost noon, I don't want to get up at all. Ciatas, why does an elf like you insist on sleeping in? You even pressed your hands and feet on me. I really miss being single. I could roll around freely in bed. Every comer will be mine, unlike now." Sigh, on the bed, elven songster Xiaofan leaned her body sideways while sleeping comfortably. Not only did she occupy nearly half of the bed, but she also left a large amount of space on her side as her body clung close to Mobit. She left one arm and leg on him, squeezing Mobit to a corner of the bed, almost to the point of falling off. After pulling up the blanket that was pinned down, Mobit sighed and closed his eyes, preparing to sleep again. Then, he really fell asleep. In his dream, he sat at the bar counter, alternating between sipping hard liquor and gulping down beers. He didn't return home as he claimed he would wait for Xiaofan to come begging him to return. Is this the aristocrat from the fourth epoch? At the entrance of the tavern, Leonard glanced at Klein. Klein gave a clear answer, "That's right." Mr. Starr's tone and action suggest that he's more nervous than before. He seems to care a lot about this aristocrat from the fourth epoch. According to the information given by Mr. World, a certain person that Mr. Starr knows might have seen the second blasphemy slate, and that's an extremely ancient divine artifact. Although I can't eliminate the possibility of seeing it in the fifth epoch, powerhouses of the fourth epoch are more likely to have a chance of coming into contact with such matters, so, this aristocrat from the fourth epoch is related to the person Mr. Starr knows? Audrey grasped certain matters through fine observation and interpretation. With this as a premise, she quickly came to a conclusion: Mr. Starr would step forward and suggest that he would guide the dream. As expected, the fourth epoch revered asymmetrical beauty, but such attire really made me uncomfortable. Leonard teased before looking at Miss Justice and the world. Klein Moretti, let me do it this time. All right, Audrey replied with a brisk tone and smile. This was a development that Klein was happy to see. He naturally wouldn't stop it. That wouldn't be an issue. Leonard then tugged at his collar and walked to the bar counter in a few steps. He sat beside Mobit and ordered a local Sanjen beer. He gulped and suddenly said, "You look like a member of the Zoroast family. Everyone here knows that." "No, not just humans." Mobit took a sip of his alcohol and continued looking forward. Leonard smiled and shook his head. "Let me introduce myself. I'm a student of Palaz Zoroast." He planned to use this identity to pull strings and reduce any sense of reluctance Mobit would have, making it easier for him to continue guiding him. Indeed, the person Mr. Starr knows is also a fourth epoch aristocrat, a member of the Zoroast family. I wonder what level that person is. So Mr. Starr is secretly a student of a certain important figure. No. He said that without complete confidence. A self-assumed student? Audrey validated her guess as her smile became more obvious. After hearing Leonard's self-introduction, Mobit finally turned his head and sized him up. He scoffed and said, "Student? More like the target of parasitizing, right?" Leonard's expression froze. Target of parasitizing. Although Audrey was mentally prepared, she couldn't help but twitch her eyebrows. As for Klein, he had a hard time holding back his laughter. Of course, he didn't believe that there was anything wrong with Leonard's identity as a student of Palaz Zoroast. If it were him, he would have said the same thing. It just wasn't right to directly mention that he was a parasite's victim, right? And being friends appeared too distant, a disadvantage for any subsequent attempts to learn more. The problem this time was that nobody expected Mobit to guess the truth. After laughing twice, Mobit looked at Leonard's slightly stiff face and said, "You aren't a member of our Zoroast family, so how can you become old man's student? You can only be a target of parasitizing." Having said that, he slowed down and said, "Don't worry. Old man isn't too bad. He wouldn't really take over your body. After the parasitizing is done, he will at most take away a few years of your life. You're still young anyway, so raising your sequence would make up for it." Heh. Actually, most Beyonders can't live till the end of their natural lifespan. Why must he take a few years of my life? Leonard subconsciously asked. Mobit raised his glass and gulped down a mouthful. He replied in a daze, since you've already been parasitized, something must be stolen, right? Leonard snapped out of his daze and asked in surprise, you also call him old man? Of course, we all call him old man. Ha ha. He doesn't seem to object to it. Mobit suddenly sighed. He is my great-grandfather, and I haven't seen him for 1,000 years, no, 2,000 years, so the reason why old man tolerates me calling him old man is because it can remind him of the beautiful past. I wonder if his direct descendants are still alive. Leonard suddenly felt wistful. As for Justice Audrey, while she was finding the words, something must be stolen, funny, she was surprised at the word, he. This represented that old man, Mr. Palaz Zoroast, was an angel. Indeed. Audrey had expected this. At this moment, Mobit sharply noticed a keyword and asked, also? Why did you say, also? Do you also call him old man? Leonard nodded seriously. Mobit was instantly puzzled as he sized up Leonard again. Don't tell me you have the bloodline of the Zoroast family? I don't know, Leonard answered honestly. Mobit shook his head. No, it doesn't look like that's the case. It might be that old man suffered a terrible blow and has changed to a certain degree. That I know. Leonard pondered and said, he was nearly killed by blasphemer Amon. He hasn't recovered yet. Grozel's travels was currently above the grey fog. It didn't matter which deity's true name was mentioned in it, since it wouldn't be sensed, therefore. Klein, Leonard, and Audrey were free to talk about Amon and Adam. The powerful and terrifying ancestor of the Amon family, Mobit's voice unconsciously lowered. Leonard finally gained the initiative and asked, the aristocrats of the Solomon Empire are all very cold and evil. Why isn't the Zoroast family like that? Chapter 1065 Cosmos Wanderer Mobit glanced at Leonard and said in puzzlement, they aren't that cold and evil. He raised his glass and took a gulp. Don't you know that the higher the sequence, the greater the inclination is towards being cold and crazy? Which major aristocratic family in the Solomon Empire doesn't have an angel? That's why they're definitely different from normal people. As for the degree of coldness and evilness, it has to do with the choice of their anchor, and the traits of their beyonder pathway. I don't know what my great-grandfather's situation is. I only know that he's very kind and amiable, and the way he speaks and acts is rather casual. In addition, the rules set by His Majesty have a key point, disharmony. If all the aristocratic families have the same style, he definitely wouldn't be satisfied. The first reason given was something I expected, but the second reason is a little unexpected, but it's quite funny. Was the Black Emperor of the Solomon Empire trying to get himself diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder? Disharmony is actually a requirement. Without wearing too thick a mask, the corners of Klein's lips curled up slightly. At this moment, Audrey turned her head to look at him and asked the same question that she had as Mr. Star, Anchor? All of them knew that the aesthetic taste of the fourth epoch was disharmony and asymmetry and had considered it common sense, so they didn't think too deeply about why there was such an aesthetic style. To the deities, believers and faith are an anchor, Klein simply explained. So that's the case. Mr. Fool also said that it's to stabilize one's condition. Audrey felt her sights broaden, allowing her to consider the relationship between the deities and believers. At the same time, she thought in puzzlement, in the early stages of Mr. Fool's reawakening, he shouldn't have many believers. Back then, what was his anchor? Leonard listened attentively as he couldn't help his expression from turning solemn. It was as though he had suddenly thought of many things. He quickly focused his attention on Mobit. After some deliberation, he said, what kind of an angel is Palaz Zoroast? What kind of habits does he have? Leonard is still very cautious. He still hasn't fully believed that the grandpa in his body is Palaz Zoroast. Yes, we can't rule out the possibility that the real Palaz has fallen, and that the one still alive is an impostor. To an angel of the marauder pathway, such an action is rather normal. And to a secret existence, replacing a particular identity is equivalent to possessing that identity, so, he wouldn't deliberately expose the truth. On more important matters, matters that he's interested in, and those that involve his safety, Leonard is more reliable than I expected. If not for that, he wouldn't have realized that I was still alive back then. As for other matters, he's just too half-hearted. He's too used to using his past experience. It's not that he isn't intelligent, but rather that he can't be bothered to use it. Klein couldn't help but sigh. Mobit was taken aback for 2 seconds before he drank a mouthful of hard liquor and said, "Old man appears to be an ordinary elder at home. He's a bit naggy and likes to throw blows at his descendants, and enjoys life. If one didn't know it ahead of time, no one would have guessed that he is a Sequence 1 angel. His aesthetic style is different from His Majesty. He is absorbed over categories and emphasizes cleanliness and tidiness. When facing enemies, he is good at trickery and often likes to finish off his enemies by making them break down. This is quite similar to how Old Man has acted to date." Leonard nodded and asked, "Do you have his portrait?" "How could I be carrying a portrait with me? It's not like I'm looking for anyone." Mobit shook his head in amusement. At this point, Leonard suddenly pointed to the side. "Isn't that it?" Mobit turned his head in confusion and doubt, only to discover that an oil painting had appeared in his right hand at some point in time. As he picked up the oil painting, the content on it gradually became clearer, revealing an old man with dark brown eyes. The man's hair was already completely white. It wasn't very sparse, and it was neatly combed to the back of his head. His forehead, the corners of his eyes, and the corners of his mouth didn't seem to have any wrinkles, not appearing too old. It was obvious that he looked quite good when he was young. He looked quite similar to Mobit, but he exuded a rather solemn air. "I really can't tell that this is a Sequence 1 angel. Is this also because he didn't reveal his mythical creature form?" Audrey tiptoed and looked at the oil painting. After Leonard memorized the contents of the portrait, he mentioned a few relevant questions related to the Zoroast family and received a satisfactory answer. The only exception was the name of the potion names of Sequence 3-0. Mobit wasn't too sure either. All he knew was that Sequence 1 was apparently Worm of Time. After ending this topic, Leonard asked about the Solomon Empire. "In your era, what major aristocratic families are there in the empire?" "There weren't many families with dukes." Mobit put down his cup and spread out his palm. "Our Zoroast family, the Abraham family, the Zeradal family. In addition, although the Medici family and Lord Ouroboros didn't have any aristocratic titles, their standing wasn't worse than the major aristocratic families." Every time he spoke, he would curl his finger, finally curling them into a fist. Then, he smiled and said, "At that time, although Tudor and the Trunsoist were the most loyal angels under His Majesty, they were still ranked beneath us. They were on par with Augustus and Castilla. The history of the Augustus family can actually be traced to the era of the Solomon Empire." While Audrey was surprised, she became even more focused on listening. Leonard thought and continued asking, "In that era, what was the situation in the northern continent?" "All living creatures submitted to His Majesty. Even deities acknowledged His Majesty's rule in order to fight against opposing factions." Mobit chuckled. "They all have countries that belong to them, in poorer places. In short, Evernight, god of combat, and death were at odds. The three deities of storm, blazing sun, and wisdom had a great conflict with each other. Earth's attitude was vague and unclear, but she was more inclined towards the god of combat. This made them unable to cooperate in a stable fashion, thus being unable to form an alliance to fight His Majesty and the true Creator." At this point, Mobit sighed and said, "And precisely for the sake of balance, His Majesty didn't attack the southern continent, and allowed death to unite the plains and the ancient forest to build the Balam Empire." No, ultimately, the 6 deities came to an agreement. Hence, the Black Emperor perished, establishing the Tudor-Trunsoist United Empire. Leonard recalled Pallas Zoroast's mention of this particular phase of history and, for a baffling reason, felt how history was filled with vicissitudes. At that moment, Mobit turned his head and looked at him. "Do you have cigarettes? These little devils that came out from the true Creator's believers aren't bad at all." Leonard immediately controlled the dream and conjured a cigarette before handing it over. "Is this an improved version?" Mobit stretched out his right hand and snaked out a ball of fire from the kitchen behind the bar. He lit the cigarette and took a deep breath. Seeing smoke coming out of his nostrils, Leonard asked curiously, "The true Creator's believers like to smoke?" "That's right. Even Lord Medici would occasionally smoke a few sticks. Although it's just a habit for him," Mobit answered without hiding anything. Leonard nodded and asked, "Which deity do you believe in?" "Of course, it's His Majesty. All the aristocrats in the Empire believe in His Majesty. Other than Lords Medici and Ouroboros. They believe in the true Creator. Also, Duke Bethel Abraham might just be faking it. According to what I know, he only believes in himself," Mobit quipped. "Bethel Abraham." A thought came to Klein. He was about to signal Leonard to ask further when he heard the poet ask, "Is Duke Bethel Abraham very powerful?" Clearly, the completely different behavior compared to the other aristocratic families in the empire made this ancestor of the Abraham family stand out. "Very powerful. Even Lord Medici and Ouroboros are afraid of him," Mobit said as he puffed out smoke rings. "In the Warring Era, he was publicly acknowledged as one of the angels most likely to become a deity." "Warring Era?" Leonard asked curiously. Mobit looked at the slowly burning cigarette in his hand and said, "This isn't thrilling enough." "Ha ha. The Warring Era refers to the time after the cataclysm ended to the point when the empire was established. It lasted about 112 years. Our Zoroast family's first angel perished in the Warring Era. Thankfully, we were helped by His Majesty before he became a god, thus, we didn't lose the Beyonder characteristic." "Who did it?" Leonard immediately asked. Mobit shook his head. "I'm not sequence 4 yet, so there are many things I'm not qualified to know. Let's talk about Duke Bethel Abraham. I actually don't really know much about him, but I was very interested in their family and the Beyonder pathway they control. It's said that the apprentice can wander the cosmos once they reach sequence 2. There are also rumors that it's at sequence 3. Cosmos?" Klein's pupils dilated slightly as he became more focused. At this moment, Mobit continued, "They left behind lots of information regarding the cosmos, recording many interesting things. Unfortunately, I never managed to borrow them. However, I heard of the 3 laws that they concluded for wandering the cosmos. First, don't respond to any calls. Second, don't be reckless and approach unknown creatures or buildings. Third, endure loneliness. It sounds like the cosmos is vast and dangerous. I wonder if the current Abraham family still has the travel notes related to the cosmos. I'll get Miss Magician to ask in the future." When Klein's gaze swept over, it happened to cross with Miss Justice's gaze that was directed at him. They immediately realized that the other party had also thought of Miss Magician. Leonard did the same. He nodded slightly and asked about other matters. During this process, the dream changed with Mobit's memories. Following that, they saw the appearances of Medici, Ouroboros, and other high-level figures. Of course, as Mobit had few interactions with the Black Emperor and Bethel Abraham and didn't dare to look at them head-on, his impression of them was a blur. Towards the end, Audrey grabbed both Klein's and Leonard's arms and jumped into Ciata's dream. This elven songster was standing in the garden holding her stomach and frowning at Mobit. "Can you steal the fetus in my stomach and stuff it into your body?" "It can be done, but even if it's stuffed into my body, I won't be able to give birth to him," Mobit replied fearfully. Ciadas thought seriously and said, then steal the corresponding organs that are needed? If it's just the simple act of theft, then it might still succeed. But for what follows after, I'll be at my wit's end. This is beyond my capabilities, Mobit said nervously. The conversation between the human and elf left the trio dumbfounded. After a few seconds, Audrey suggested, why don't I do it this time? Chapter 1066 Familiar name. Upon hearing Miss Justice's suggestion, Klein thought for a moment and said, guide the dream towards matters encompassing the second epoch's history, the Queen of Calamity Kohainum, elf habits, and the most ancient language of the elves, as well as the legendary Western continent. All right. Audrey's eyes moved slightly, revealing a thoughtful expression as she digested the information that Mr. World had said. Then, she walked to the elven songster's side. Under her guidance, Mobit's figure in the garden rapidly blurred as he vanished from Ciadas's dream. The ripples in Audrey's green eyes stirred once again as her lips quivered, as though she was reciting something. The entire dream world began to shake as the garden was like a reflection of a lake that was smashed into pieces by an invisible stone that flew over from nowhere. These fragments quickly gathered, but the scene that was restored was no longer a garden, but that of a palace made of coral. Every detail in the palace was abnormally gorgeous. The entire structure was tall and majestic, but due to the layers of blue seawater, the sky couldn't be seen, making it appear dark and gloomy. Inside it, coral pillars propped up an exaggerated dome, and the walls and the top of it were filled with terrifying murals of the storm. Above the murals and corals, silver bolts of lightning followed a certain trajectory as if they were alive. Finally, they converged at the 9 steps that were inlaid with pearls, diamonds, emerald, and turquoise. Ciadas was standing there, with many elves standing opposite her. On the 9 steps, there were 2 huge chairs that seemed to be formed purely of lightning. One of them occupied the center, just like the ruler of this palace. One of them was on its left, appearing less eye-catching. Sitting on the throne in the middle was a man wearing a simple loose robe. His ears were pointed, and his facial features were rather soft and his hair thick. His hair was a mix of black and blue colors. Not only did his facial features look outstanding on their own, they combined together to form an even more handsome face. However, he directly gave one a tyrannous impression, as though he wouldn't say a word before picking up the electric spear leaning on his armrest, and then throwing it. Sitting beside him was a beautiful woman with raven-black hair. Her hair was tied up into a high bun, her ears slightly pointed, and her facial features delicate. She had dark brown eyes that were as deep as the ocean, and in her hands, she was playing with a complicated golden wine cup. Without needing Ciadas's introduction, Klein and company could easily determine that this couple was the Elf King, the ancient god, Sanayathrim, and the Elf Queen, Queen of Calamity, Kohainum. That traitor, Ormer. Suddenly, a voice resembling loud thunder boomed, causing the entire palace to shake violently. It made Ciadas and the other attendants lower their heads in fear. This roar came from the ancient god. Ormer, isn't that the name of the giant king? I've recently been drinking red wine named after him. I have to say that its quality is indeed higher than anything else. It's just a little expensive. As Klein listened, he had a random thought. He remembered that Little Sun had once said that giant King Ormer, Elf King Sanayathrim, and sanguine ancestor Lilith, the 3 humanoid ancient gods, were allies. They fought against the opposing camp formed by Dragon of Imagination, Ankwelt, Phoenix Ancestor, Greg Race, and the Mutant King, Kvaster. As for the Devil Monarch, Farbody, and the Annihilation Demonic Wolf, Fleegria, they were independent beings who wanted to subvert all order and corrupt all living beings. So, the alliance of 3 humanoid ancient gods eventually collapsed. Klein reined in his thoughts and waited for the subsequent changes in the dream. Due to Derek's existence, Audrey wasn't unfamiliar with the history of the Second Epoch. Without any hesitation, she directly made Ciadas's dream continue its development. Despite the terrifying roar, Queen of Calamity Kohinum wasn't affected at all. With a cold expression, she calmly said, "Wasn't this already long confirmed? His reputation is exactly the opposite of his physical build." At that moment, the ancient god, Saniathrim, had already been enveloped by bolts of lightning. He said in a thunderous voice, "I thought that, after centuries, he would understand the global situation even more. I've overestimated his intelligence. If he didn't sell out Lilith back then, how could she have perished?" The sanguine ancestor Lilith perished so early? Klein's eyelids twitched as he quickly focused his attention. After the Elf King finished roaring, Queen of Calamity Kohinum maintained her previous posture and said, "That's not a bad thing. At the very least, Kvastor and Phlegria were dragged to the grave together with Lilith. All the deities no longer trust each other. Even if we don't form an alliance, we can rule the ocean, lakes, and rivers." Upon hearing these words, spectator Audrey couldn't help but feel alarmed. She had no choice but to use placate on herself. It means that the sanguine ancestor Lilith, mutant king Kvastor, and the annihilation demonic wolf Phlegria perished in a battle between ancient gods. So the betrayal of giant King Ormur and the other ancient gods had nothing to do with the ancient sun god? This is why Lilith didn't fully die and is still able to occasionally deliver divine revelations. And because of this, the Antigonus Mother of the Sky and Hornacis mountain range managed to survive to the fourth epoch. Klein increasingly believed that the history recorded in the City of Silver had many fabrications or vague records. Thankfully, he hadn't completely digested the Bizarro Sorcerer potion and didn't need to consider advancing to Scholar of Yore. Otherwise, the history he used might not be real. In ancient times, the sanguine ancestor Lilith and mutant king Kvastor perished due to the other. The sanguine has recently been working with the mutants' temperance faction. Time sure is a great magician. Heh, if the moon Emlyn were to know of this, I wonder what kind of expression he would have. The star Leonard sighed as he thought. As their thoughts raced, the ancient god, Saniathrim, scoffed and said, "Recently, Ormur wanted to work with some secret sects that have sprouted from the humans to deal with us. Apparently, this matter is led by Harvest and Dawn. I'm even thinking of working with Ankwelt to destroy the giants and the Giant King's court. Unfortunately, every time I see that dragon, I have the urge to string it up on a grill. It's a type of attraction that's simply irresistible." Just as he said that, the ancient god suddenly vanished. The entire palace shook violently, causing a rift to appear. All of this had yet to subside when a bolt of lightning flashed. Saniathrim returned to the massive throne, holding a spear made of pure lightning. "You went to the Giant King's court?" Kohinum asked. "I taught Ormur a lesson," Saniathrim answered without hiding anything. Ciatas and the other elven attendants lowered their heads even further. They faintly saw slippery tentacles that were thicker than their bodies flipping about on the ground, flashing with silver bolts of lightning. Then, they shut their eyes. The dream changed as Ciatas recalled her interaction with other elves. With their conversations and interactions, Klein, Leonard, and Audrey learned that Ciatas lived in a relatively peaceful time period in the Second Epoch. The giants, elves, dragons, devils, and phoenixes coexisted, splitting up their rule over the northern and southern continent, as well as the 5 seas. Vampires, demonic wolves, treants, sea monsters, mutants, and humans were vassals of the different factions, occupying the lower middle classes. This doesn't resemble the history recorded by the Church. Even the legends in the City of Silver aren't like this. Leonard sighed when he heard that. Old man probably doesn't know this much. That isn't necessarily true. Klein shook his head indiscernibly. Many existences in the Second Epoch have survived to the Fourth Epoch, or even to this very moment. For example, the Wisdom Angel? Leonard asked with a guess. Perhaps. Klein didn't give an affirmative answer as he said with a smile, when you were talking to Mobit, I thought you would make Miss Justice stand further away." Leonard immediately shot a glance at him and yawned. "You mentioned before that there's an existence behind me that might have been seen the second blasphemy slate. Then, when I was conversing with Mobit Zoroast, wouldn't she be able to make the connection for me getting her to stand further away? Besides, you also mentioned that back when dealing with all of Amon's avatars in Backland, part of the cleanup operation involved Miss Justice. To a Sequence 5 spectator, what she knows is sufficient. Once she understands the Zoroast family's matters, the truth is practically in front of her eyes. In that case, why waste time trying to avoid her? It's too troublesome. I might as well get Mr. Fool to be a witness, as everyone vows not to divulge each other's secrets." Klein nodded slightly and said, "If you were to get Miss Justice to stand further away, it wouldn't be easy for you to bring up the matter of making a vow to keep things a secret." At this moment, Ciadas continued, "After the death of the Sanguine Ancestor, the Annihilation Demonic Wolf, and the Mutant King, some of their subsidiary gods were killed, while others surrendered to other ancient gods. There were a few who vanished as they hid in the shadows." Having transformed herself into an elf, Audrey immediately asked, "Who surrendered to who? Who died?" Ciadas recalled and said, "I've never even seen it before. The Sanguine's goddess of life and the Mutant King's god of war were killed. No one even remembers their names. The Annihilation Demonic Wolf's god of the dead, Salinger, came under the Phoenix Ancestor. The Sanguine's goddess of beauty, Ornia, came under us. The Mutant King's god of spiritual creatures, Tolzna, and Annihilation Demonic Wolf's goddess of misfortune, Ammonizes, vanished, Salinger. Ornia." These two names made Klein's forehead twitch. He instinctively used his clown powers to maintain his facial expression. Ornia was the Blood Moon Queen, the wife of the Fourth Epoch's Emperor, the Empress of the Trunsoist Empire. As for Salinger, he was the founder of the Balam Empire, the Emperor of the Underworld, Death. Chapter 1067, The Elven Version of History. The Second Epoch subsidiary gods truly are hidden powers. There was Dragon of Wisdom, Haraburgen, and there's God of the Dead, Salinger. They were all powerful figures that even reached the throne of Sequence 0. Of course, I can't be sure about the Dragon of Wisdom. It's just quite possible. Yes, and there's the God of Dawn, Badheil, and the Goddess of Harvest, Omabella. I can't rule out the possibility that they have lived quite well all the way to the Fifth Epoch. I wonder if the god of spiritual creatures Tolzna and the goddess of misfortune Ammonizes managed to evade the authority retrieval operation by the City of Silver Creator at the end of the Second Epoch. If they managed to escape that fate, what roles did they play in the Third and Fourth Epoch? After a moment of shock, Klein began thinking poignantly. Thinking back to the betrayal of the kings of angels in the Third Epoch, he couldn't help but lampoon, "You have to be careful of fire, theft, and subsidiary gods." At that moment, Audrey, who didn't know much about the subsidiary gods' true names or authorities, didn't show any perturbations in her emotions. She acted as different female elves in Ciadas's memories, and she constantly talked to her about her experiences and things she knew about the Second Epoch. According to Ciadas, in the history of the elves, there was no concept of the First Epoch or Second Epoch. In the beginning years that were unknown to her, it was chaotic, dark, and crazy, and it didn't leave behind any texts. After the supernatural races obtained a certain level of intelligence and had their own languages, creatures finally had some knowledge of history. In that era, ancient gods appeared one after another. The sky, the land, the sea, and the underground world slowly changed from disorderliness to orderliness. However, other than the tyrannical and crazy ancient gods, no one knew how many years this stage lasted. She just knew that, very, very long ago, it was referred to by the major supernatural races as the Sprouting Era. After the Sprouting Era was the Early Era of Fire, in which the 8 ancient gods fought against each other in different camps. This was also a long time before Xiaoda's birth, so she could only understand this from the elven historical records that it was a time when quasi-humans fought non-humans, resisting the corruption and intrusion from the devils and demonic wolves. Amongst them, the humanoids were the giants, elves, sanguine, as well as their slaves. The early era of fire lasted different periods of time according to the different records. However, a common point was that it lasted less than 1,000 years, as the essence of the ancient gods was madness, tyranny, cruel, and cold. They were often driven by their instinct. After the sanguine ancestor Lilith, mutant king Kvaster, and annihilation demonic wolf Flegria perished during the betrayal, the D3RLY Elm of Fire ended, and the war broke out. The world was damaged, and it didn't stop for centuries. Due to the fact that the giants and dragons were relatively strong in this period of time, they were known as the Dual Era. By the time the 5 races formed a new balance of powers, the Northern Continent, the Southern Continent, the East Continent, and the 5 seas had recovered some level of peace. This was when Xiaoda was born and had grown up in until she entered Grozel's travels. In the history that she described, there were 2 important points. First of all, it proved the existence of the East Continent, a place where the giant king's court was. Second, after the Sprouting Era, the supernatural races had their own kind of civilization. They weren't completely irrational as their descendants believed them to be. Of course, the inclination towards tyranny, cruelty, coldness, and slaughtering still existed, as though they were all in a half-state of losing control. It was only after the Dual Era that the new generation of elves and giants gained some level of rationality. They had feelings just like Xiaoda and Grozel. The East Continent seems to be the forsaken land of the gods. It was abandoned during the Cataclysm. Similar thoughts surfaced in Klein's, Leonard's, and Audrey's minds. They were very interested in this, but it was a pity that Xiaoda had always lived in the Elf King's court. Their occasional forays outside were limited to parades at sea. She had never been to the East Continent, and she lacked the required knowledge. Under Audrey's influence, Xiaoda's dream began to show the traditions and language of the elves. According to the legends that the queen's attendant had heard of, Elvish was created by the king in the Sprouting Era. Every word was produced with the birth of a first-generation elf. The number of Elvish words meant the number of first-generation elves. However, the traditions of the elves weren't too unified. They relied heavily on their surroundings. The elves in the forests and the sea were undoubtedly different in all kinds of customs. What they shared in common was that they believed in the king, who was an ancient god, and his queen. They liked to make food with the blood of their prey. Many of them had culinary methods such as roasting. Even sea elves often came up to the reefs for a bonfire party. They were close to nature and were good at using all kinds of spices. They idolized the strong, and they were proud of being quick to act before thinking. With myths and reality mixed together, it's hard to tell what's real and what's fake. Their traditions have destroyed my previous theories. Klein listened with a stoic expression as he quickly analyzed every word Xiaoda said. After figuring out the relevant matters, Audrey circled around the keyword of the West Continent and made Xiaoda's dream change. It reflected some of her subconscious memories. The Coral Palace appeared before Klein and company again. Xiaoda followed behind Queen of Calamity Kohinam and walked to a crystal window. She glanced at the queen's exquisite and complicated dress, and she stole a glance at the deity who controlled calamities. She asked curiously, "Your Highness, are you looking west?" To the elves, as long as they didn't feel the pressure of violence, they would ask questions on the spot. "Why do you think so?" Kohinam didn't turn back as she asked with an indifferent expression. "I just learned of a legend that our elves originated from the Western Continent," Xiaoda replied. "Your Highness, does the Western Continent really exist? Is that really where the first-generation elves were born?" Kohinam's lips curled slightly as she said with a slightly ethereal voice, "The Western Continent may exist, but it may not exist either. Every race needs to give themselves an illustrious origin, a home for the mind. Xiaotas, where is your home to you? My home? Xiaotas repeated the question as she replied blankly, it's where His Majesty and Your Highness are. It's this palace that can lead to the forest where my parents live. As she said this, Xiaotas's emotions gradually turned heavy, lost, and melancholic. It was obvious that she was influenced by her subconscious's corresponding memories. She had entered Grozel's travels and had been away from home for 2,000 to 3,000 years. Therefore, to elves like you, the Western continent doesn't exist, but to some elves, it definitely exists. Queen of Calamity Kohainam calmly gave her final answer. Xiaotas didn't ask further, because she suddenly remembered that the queen wasn't a first-generation elf. Such a response made Klein increasingly confused and puzzled. Thankfully, from the second epoch to the fifth epoch, the Western continent had zero presence, so it didn't have any important secrets related to him. He was just trying to find out more about it and hadn't held out much hope. After ending the guiding of Xiaotas's subconscious and since it was almost noon, without any other nearby dreams that they could leap into, Audrey left with Klein and Leonard, and they appeared in Mobit and Xiaotas's bedroom. Looking at the fourth epoch Viscount whose body had been tightly bound by the elf, Audrey's expression suddenly turned gentle as she said with a laugh, they seem to be doing pretty well. No, it's terrifying to have such a violent, direct, and imaginative wife who dares to take action. Only a person like Mobit would like and enjoy being with her. Leonard, who didn't have a poet's talent but had the liberal inclinations of a poet, shook his head as he kept his hands in his pockets. At this point, he muttered in thought, on the contrary, it's true that an experienced thief needs a woman like Xiaotas to rein him in. I wonder what kind of members of the opposite sex old man's other family members like. Sigh, they don't need our envy or objections. This is how they live together. Emperor Roselle once wrote a poem, saying, for my love I'll sacrifice my life. As Klein listened to their discussion, he opened his mouth and closed it again. He didn't tell them that Xiaotas and Mobit had actually died. It was only when they died that they truly felt their love for one another. The ones living in the book were just copies created by the book world. After leaving the couple's house, the trio headed to Grozel's blacksmith shop. Along the way, when they went past a street, Klein saw Frunzier, who was known as a philosopher, and Audrey recognized him to be Loanese a glance. Is that the soldier from 100 years ago? Audrey slowed down her pace and asked. Klein recalled Frunzier's longing for his hometown, and the ashes he had placed in Backlund Cemetery. He fell silent for 2 seconds before nodding gently. Yes. Mr. World is feeling a little emotional. He's like a calm river on the surface, with a lot of undercurrents and eddies underneath. Audrey nodded indiscernibly and asked, can we enter his dream? I want to get the judge and disciplinary paladin's potion formula. No problem, Klein replied as he glanced at Leonard. Leonard continued having his hands in his pockets, but his eyes instantly darkened. Sitting on the bench, Frunzier fell asleep. Right on the heels of that, 3 people appeared in his dream. This was a bustling city with buildings made from wood. The pedestrians who came and went were mostly Loanese. The black-haired, blue-eyed Frunzier stood outside a house as he looked in without daring to approach. Only when a woman wearing an old long dress came out from inside did he excitedly go forward and attempt to hug her. His hug went through the woman without them making contact at all. Frunzier stood rooted to the ground as he blankly shouted, Mother. Audrey, who wanted to guide the dream, quietly watched this scene. Then, she looked around and discovered the iconic clock. Backlund. Audrey pursed her lips and turned her head. She looked at Klein and asked, can't they leave the book world? It's been too long. If they leave, they will grow old, die, or even be reduced to dust. Klein's voice was like a serene river. I delivered one of Frunzier's items to Backlund. This. As a spectator, Audrey acutely sensed the cruel reality behind those words. She couldn't help but raise her head and look out of the dream, looking at the location where Mobit and Ciadas were. Leonard wanted to ask what it was, but after looking around, he maintained his silence. Following that, Audrey seriously guided his dream. Outside of obtaining 2 potion formulas, she made Frunzier return home and live happily with his parents, brothers, and sisters. It was a beautiful dream. After leaving Frunzier, Klein, Leonard, and Audrey quickly saw Grozel's home. This was the last stop of their exploration. After obtaining information from Grozel's subconscious, they would enter the book world sea of collective subconscious and seek out the secrets that might exist in this book. 1. Adapted from a Hungarian poet, Sandor Petőfi's Liberty and Love. Chapter 1068 Illogical Details. Which one is Grozel? In the dream, Leonard looked ahead blankly. There was a huge bonfire there, and there were more than 10 grayish-blue-skinned, single-eyed giants who looked no different from each other. To be honest, I wouldn't be able to recognize him without the ability of a faceless. To me, without their age, hairstyle, height, scars, clothes, and maturity, giants all look the same. Klein mumbled inwardly as he looked calmly at Miss Justice, as though saying that it shouldn't stump a spectator. Audrey raised her hand and pointed at a giant who was gulping down alcohol. From time to time, he would shout twice to express his approval. That's Grozel. It looks like, in the traditions of the giants, clapping isn't a sign of affirmation and praise. Instead, it's a roar. The louder the roar, the higher the level of praise. Miss Justice is acting like a folk scholar now. Thankfully, he's only shouting and not singing. If not, the noise would be worse. It's obvious that the giants here aren't adept at modulating their voices. That roar from before didn't have any rhythm to it. Klein nodded and said to Audrey, "Begin guiding him then." As Audrey went forward as Leonard stepped back. He raised his right hand and stroked his chin. "Tell me, in the second epoch, which supernatural race widely possessed the beyonder characteristics of the Evernight pathway? Isn't it the demonic wolves?" Klein glanced at Leonard, wondering if the poet had contracted the traditional disease of the Nighthawks having a bad memory. "I know." Leonard maintained his original posture as he said with a strange expression, "Then how do they act as a midnight poet? Or should I say that the potion's name back then was called Midnight Roarer? There wasn't a potion name in the beginning." Klein's thoughts were accidentally led astray by Leonard. The scene of such fellows crouching on the ground and howling at the moon surfaced in his mind. He couldn't help but mutter, "This might be more suitable for you. There's no need to write poems," making it very easy. The corners of Leonard's mouth twitched as he said, "There are different types of poets. I'm a singing type." As the two idly chatted, Audrey's guidance attempt gradually pushed through. Grozel's dream began showing the waning forest, barren tunnel, the corner of the Giant King's court, Dawn Town, and the Nation of Gold. Grozel wasn't a subordinate of the deities, like the Giant King, and he was only able to occasionally see these high-level existences while on duty at the waning forest or in particular spots of the Giant King's court and passageway. Furthermore, he didn't dare look at them head-on, receiving them while genuflecting and having his head bowed. Therefore, he wasn't able to present the images of Giant King Ormer, Giant Queen Omabella, and the eldest son of the Giant King, God of Dawn, Badhile. They only appeared as portraits. Similarly, Grozel knew very few secrets. His grasp of history and the situation in the world was completely incomparable to elven songster Ciadas. However, an interesting point was that in the Giant King's court and the giants, the traitor was synonymous with Saniathrim. They claimed that his abandoning of the alliance had resulted in the sanguine ancestor Lilith's death. Klein strongly suspected that, because of his bad temper, Saniathrim was obviously not good at such things. The Queen of Calamity seems capable, but the problem is what she plots is extremely hard to hide from her spouse, a true ancient god, Saniathrim. In contrast, Giant King Ormer being the traitor makes more sense. Klein did a rough analysis as Audrey changed the direction of guidance in an attempt to let Grosel present anything he had seen or heard beyond the Giant King's court. It was a pity that, shortly after the giant left the king's court and passed through Dawn Town before arriving in the Nation of Gold, he obtained the book and entered it. He didn't know much about the styles and appearances of people from different regions. Currently, the most valuable piece of information is how to avoid the front entrance after entering the Giant King's court from Afternoon Town. It's through the Waning Forest and the Barren Tunnel. Audrey ended the guidance and walked back to Klein's and Leonard's side. This is very useful for Little Sun and Company's subsequent explorations. Yes, we can tell him at the next gathering. Klein nodded. Just as he was about to suggest that they enter the book world sea of collective subconscious through Grosel's dream, Audrey suddenly looked back and said in thought, "There's one detail that's illogical." Which detail? Leonard seriously recalled what he had seen and heard, but he didn't find anything suspicious. Just as Audrey glanced at the world and said, "In the matter regarding how Giant King Ormer's father and mother are buried in the Waning Forest, the rule that only the ancient god can enter is illogical." Klein didn't notice that there was something wrong with that detail. But after Miss Justice mentioned it, he immediately had some ideas. He deliberated and said, "The father and mother of the Giant King are equivalent to the ancestors of the giants. Normally speaking, they should be consecrated by the entire race, that's right. Regardless of the race, they'll have some level of worship towards their ancestor. The giants are no exception. From Grosel's dream, the keepers often make sacrifices to the ancestors outside the Waning Forest." Audrey nodded in agreement. If there aren't any other factors of influence, the Giant King should occasionally organize things and make it a point to honor their ancestors instead of making it a rule that only he can enter. Perhaps the Waning Forest contains immense danger. Aren't the oldest giants crazy, violent, and irrational? After their death, their corpses have corrupted the environment and affected the entire forest. It's not something that can't be understood. Leonard gave his opinion. Audrey and Klein shook their heads at the same time, denying the statement. If it's only danger or corruption, Giant Queen Omabella and the god of dawn Badhile can clearly withstand that. With the help of the Giant King, there are almost no problems. Yet, they are also forbidden from entering the Waning Forest, even with the ancient god by their side. Klein simply explained his thoughts and guesses. Perhaps what's buried inside isn't Giant King Ormer's parents, there might be some other secret. That's more likely the case. Audrey nodded seriously. She wore a silver mask, and her green eyes darted around slightly, faintly revealing a hint of curiosity. If that's the case, what would a secret that can't be known to his wife, child, subsidiary gods, or fellow members of the same race be? That's quite interesting, Leonard smiled as he allowed his thoughts to wander. After another round of discussion, the three of them made use of the time to enter the Giant King's court through the barren tunnel and enter the place that was frozen amidst the sunset. According to Klein's experience, this was actually the path to the borders of Grosel's dream. This time, there was no need for him to activate creeping hunger and use the strength of a zombie to open the heavy door to the giant guard's quarters. Audrey directly influenced the dream and made the door flutter open like a piece of paper. Due to the unshadowed crucifix, Klein was unable to wear the human-skinned glove. Outside the door was a hazy world. There was no longer the scene of the Giant King's court ahead of them, but a cliff. After a brief exchange of the various situations that could occur in the sea of collective subconscious, Audrey made a staircase appear on the edge of the cliff. The staircase spun around, sinking deep into the dark, hazy, silent, and bottomless mind world. The three of them didn't delay as they stepped onto the staircase and walked down. In this lonely environment that could drive one crazy, Audrey used placate a few times every time they traveled a certain distance. This wasn't only to placate Klein, Leonard, and herself, but it was also to placate the grayish-white cliff Grosel's subconscious. It was to prevent him from causing a stir that would contaminate their astral projection and body of heart and mind. The countless rotting giant palms that Klein encountered the last time didn't appear. Even the most unbearable feelings of loneliness, silence, and being infinite didn't feel that terrifying thanks to being able to speak to each other. This is the mind world. The domain of consciousness is indeed different from the others. Leonard looked around as though he wanted to use a few poems to express his feelings, but he eventually chose to give up. If it were any other mission elsewhere, Klein might have asked his dear poet to remain quiet, but here, he felt that it was good for him to say something, anything. Audrey didn't reject the exchange as she said seriously, "That's the essence of the environment that we can sense. The cliffs, precipices, and the hazy world are a reflection of our subconscious. If it were another race, it might not be like that. I now find psychology rather interesting," Leonard said with interest after hearing that. Klein glanced at him and resisted the urge to say that, with his personality and habits, he really wasn't suited to the spectator pathway. In this exchange, the three of them lost track of time until they finally stepped onto the solid but hazy ground. Looking upwards, they could see the undulating shadows. They overlapped and formed an illusory sea. Klein, Leonard, and Audrey were about to walk forward when a water spout suddenly surged over. A rather blurry figure stood up from within. It was a grayish-blue giant that was 6 to 7 meters tall. His chest was covered with dragon scales, and there were all sorts of indescribable patterns, symbols, and labels that went beyond what one would consider a normal language. His single vertical eye was filled with blood vessels as it emitted a violent aura that couldn't be concealed. It had obvious hints of destruction in it as it gnawed on a bloody human leg. This was a demigod-level giant. He was a projection left in the sea of collective subconscious. Perhaps it was an actual encounter with a human or some other race's ancestor, or perhaps it was something Grosel and the other giants had heard about. The moment he appeared, the madness spread towards Klein and company like a plague that could infect them. This was a world that directly came into contact with one's mind and consciousness. Chapter 1069 Under the Sea, the leg-gnawing giant, whose vertical eye was filled with blood-red threads, wasn't actually real. He was, in essence, a strong emotion produced by a particular living creature. The emotions that originated from having a deep impression had entered the subconscious. It spread from one's island of consciousness to the surrounding illusory sea, before slowly settling and forming a mark. It wasn't possible for all of its emotions and consciousness to ultimately settle Daoi as the foundation. Most of them would be washed away with time by the seawater. Only extremely intense and repeated experiences would remain. And once it formed a mark, it would be a drop of water in the sea of collective subconscious which would then affect living creatures of the same species in its surroundings. It would be a shared, ancient memory carved into one's pulse. Therefore, not only was the phantom image of the giant blurry, but it also had many mistakes caused by the subjective aspects of the mind. Normally, it wouldn't result in Leonard and Audrey being unable to look straight at it, confusing their spirituality and breaking down their minds. However, the madness that came with it, an extreme sense of horror that stemmed from an unknown person, seemed all so real. It could contaminate every living creature's body of heart and mind, astral projection, and even soul body. This was the essence of the danger in the sea of collective subconscious. It didn't stem from the strength, level, and status itself, but from the emotions and feelings that were generated and imprinted there. Of course, if one were to encounter a mark left behind by a high-level creature or deity, they could directly see some type or multiple types of mythical creature forms. However, the result was definitely nothing rosy. One would either have a mental breakdown or go crazy. Otherwise, they would be completely contaminated by the deity or high-level creature's emotions and feelings. Their outcome would ultimately be completely unpredictable. All in all, in this sea of collective subconscious, the style of combat was different from the outside world. Sometimes, the more anxious one was at trying to destroy the illusory figure, the more likely one would be contaminated by their stirring emotions. It was precisely because of this that when Klein saw the 7-8-meter-tall, grayish-blue giant rush over, he immediately took the initiative to control his emotions. Then, he used illusion creation. The target of illusion creation was Leonard and Audrey. In the eyes of these two sequence 5 beyonders, those 2-3-story, tall giants no longer had the madness and violence that left one trembling from one's heart. Everything seemed normal and ordinary. Therefore, before those extreme feelings could truly contaminate them, Leonard and Audrey remained very calm, without showing any emotional fluctuations. Then, with one hand in his pocket, Leonard reached out with his right hand and slightly opened his mouth. Having become a spirit warlock, he originally wanted to use the first spirit, a terror banshee, that he sealed in his tooth with the help of the archbishop. It was a powerful spirit world creature with a beautiful face and rotting body. It had a pair of huge eagle wings and was good at draining the consciousness of others, injecting feelings of terror in them. However, he quickly remembered that not only was he in an astral projection form, but he had also been cleansed by the gray fog. How could there be other spirits still on him? He had no choice but to use a soul assurer's powers, turning his green eyes deep and quiet. The giant shadow instantly slowed down as if it was soothed. At this moment, Audrey calmly spread her arms wide and used placate. An invisible wind blew past, and the giant figure seemed to pause as it instantly weakened the contamination around it. During this process, Klein took out the bronze cross that had many sharp spikes. As he opened the bottle containing his blood, he poured a few drops onto it and solemnly said, "Light." Brilliant, pure, and flawless light burst out, and amidst Klein's fluttering black trench coat, the giant phantom was drowned by the light. The grayish-blue giant melted away almost immediately. One of the main powers of the unshadowed crucifix was to cleanse and purify lingering spiritual imprints. This was the reason why Klein brought this sealed artifact along. And when he used the cross from the ancient sun god, Klein dispelled the illusion, allowing the star Leonard and Justice Audrey to see the true appearance of the giant to enrich their experiences in such matters. Although it didn't even take a second before the giant phantom was drowned by the endless light, Audrey and Leonard still felt dizzy. An irresistible sense of fear surged from deep within their hearts, and they almost broke down. This state didn't last too long, as Audrey instinctively used placate to calm her emotions before treating Mr. Star and Mr. World's psychological problems one by one. How scary, is this a giant at the demigod level? When the light dissipated, Audrey looked around and sighed. In that instant, she had a deeper understanding of the sentence, "Do not look directly at God." Even at the saint level, the remnant impression a demigod leaves behind in a memory can't be seen directly, let alone a real deity. Leonard was also experienced. He laughed self-deprecatingly and said, "Sequence 4 is indeed a qualitative change in life's natural order." However, that wasn't very scary. It wasn't as intense as when I was facing a pregnant woman. Is the essence of a poet to boast? At that time, you could still control yourself, but you were almost on the verge of breaking down just now. However, if Megos gave birth to that child, we would probably lose control and turn into monsters just by looking at her. As Klein lampooned Leonard, it stirred up some memories as he sighed poignantly. Was that pregnant lady a demigod? Audrey asked curiously. No. Leonard shook his head. But she was pregnant with an evil god's spawn. Is that so? Audrey didn't ask further. She knew very well that the adventure and exploration hadn't ended, and that wasting time wasn't an option. She then looked at Gehrman Sparrow, who was wearing a black trench coat and holding a bronze cross and small metal bottle, and said with a smile, "Thank you for affecting our senses. Where should we go next?" As an experienced spectator, it wasn't difficult to determine the fact that she had received Mr. World's help from making a comparison. Klein controlled himself from subconsciously furrowing his brows, and he looked around. Doesn't this sea of collective subconscious have a core region to it? No. Audrey shook her head seriously. Wherever there are living beings, there's a sea of subconscious. There's no such thing as someone who's more important and lofty. This illusory sea won't really stir, and the situations within the different areas will depend on their actual surroundings. We call it a precipitating effect. To put it simply, the sea of collective subconscious of Lone will be quite different from Intis, because it precipitates the strong emotions and feelings of generations of Loanese. In contrast, this will also affect the citizens of both countries, making them have different qualities and personalities to a certain extent. After explaining this a little, Audrey concluded, if that's the case, how can there be a general consensus of a core within the sea of collective subconscious? Klein nodded and asked thoughtfully, in other words, you can't give any effective suggestions on where to go? Mr. World is so direct. If it were another lady or gentleman with a more fragile heart, they would definitely be embarrassed and feel hurt. As the thought flashed through her mind, Audrey saw the World's pair of deep, brown eyes which were nearly black in color. They were in no way crazy or cold. Instead, they were calm and tranquil. Audrey instantly came to a realization. She realized that Mr. World was doing such things on purpose so that she could experience the various problems within the details of a joint operation, allowing her to gain more experience. Yes. She nodded frankly, not feeling embarrassed at all. Klein secretly nodded and looked at the star Leonard. Don't look at me. My expertise isn't in this strange sea of collective subconscious. Leonard immediately waved his hands. Compared to Miss Justice, having participated in countless operations, he knew that he shouldn't force it when he shouldn't. Then follow me. Klein looked away and moved the unshadowed crucifix which had turned bronze again to the hand holding the metal bottle, and he took out a gold coin. Ding! As the gold coin tumbled, he grabbed it without looking at the results. He looked in a direction and widened his stride. This is a divination technique. Audrey was enlightened. She looked at the World's serious and calm side profile, black trench coat, silk top hat, and bronze cross. For some reason, she felt like the other party was a preacher. Leonard suddenly recalled something from the past. It was the first case he had worked with Klein, to find a kidnapped child. At that time, it was also a way for Klein to lead the way through divination. He had been beside him the entire time. Compared to his awkwardness before, it seems as if he had entered the mysterious world for more than 10 years now. Sigh, it's only been over a year. Leonard placed his hands in his pockets as he followed closely behind Klein. Audrey glanced at him and felt the change in his mood. Mr. Star and Mr. World not only know each other in real life, but they were probably rather close friends. Yes, they have at least met frequently in the past 1 to 2 years. As she made the judgment, she didn't slow down her steps. Combining what she had learned, she observed the surroundings and identified which spots might hide maelstrom and dangerous creatures. With her help, Klein's lead went very smoothly. It was nothing like how they had directly encountered a mark like the giant phantom. Occasionally, they would walk straight and turn at other times. After some time, the area before the trio suddenly opened up. In front of them was a huge crater in the deep sea. In the middle of the pit was an island-sized city. The foundation of the city was grayish-white in color, and on it were several 100-meter-tall magnificent stone columns. They either stood there on their own, or they held up majestic ancient palaces together. They were bizarre and magnificent, unlike something built by ordinary creatures. Although Audrey didn't know the city, an idea instantly appeared in her mind: City of Miracles, Liveseed. Chapter 1070. Maybe its real Liveseed was a floating city that the dragon of imagination Ankwelt imagined out of thin air. No matter what, it was a miracle, a divine miracle. It was even more magnificent than the giant king's court, more rugged and unique. Every stone pillar was nearly 100 meters tall, like a throne for the dragon to rest on. It was a city that left a deep, unforgettable impression just from hearing about it. Therefore, although Audrey had never actually seen the City of Miracles, she instantly made connections from witnessing the scene. Of course, one of the main reasons for knowing that was because she knew that Groselle's travels came from the Dragon of Imagination, Ankwelt. As for Klein, as he had once divined the origins of Groselle's travels and had seen the real City of Miracles, the floating city, and now, he was sure that the island-sized city in the middle of the deep-sea crater was identical to Liveseed. All it lacked were the dragons that flew in every direction. Is this real, or is it a clone? Or is it a gathering of some special creature's subconscious in the book world? Klein was slightly surprised as he quickly analyzed the situation. According to his divination results and the contents of the dream from giant guardian Groselle and elven songster Ciadas, he was certain that, when Groselle's travels was created, the City of Miracles Liveseed still existed. When it reached the giant king's court, the City of Miracles Liveseed still existed. When Groselle began his adventure and when Ciadas was sucked into the book world, Liveseed still existed. If the City of Miracles Liveseed were to vanish, the various supernatural races wouldn't have any reaction. In other words, these facts were undeniable proof that the city in the middle of the deep-sea crater was unlikely to be Liveseed. But very quickly, Klein remembered something. That was the answer that Rhodes had once given him, certain that it first appeared among the dragons, after the disappearance of the City of Miracles, Liveseed. This is interesting. What did the magic mirror rely on to confirm that Groselle's travels was the first to appear and to believe that it was after the disappearance of the City of Miracles Liveseed? It wasn't even able to see matters related to Zeradal, so how could it pry into the origins of an ancient god's possession? I originally used this conclusion to infer and consider things, but this point was completely overturned by my divination. I never expected. Klein observed the tall stone columns and magnificent city as many thoughts ran through his mind. Suddenly, he grasped onto an idea. The last owner of Groselle's travel was Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina, a member of the Church of Knowledge. They believe in the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. The God of Knowledge and Wisdom can almost be confirmed to be one of the kings of angels who served the ancient sun god, the Angel of Wisdom, and from the Church's history and the history of the Third Epoch, it's reasonable to suspect that the Angel of Wisdom is most likely the Dragon of Wisdom, Harabergen. This was the Dragon of Imagination Ankwelt's subsidiary god, a high-level member of the dragons. The appearance of Groselle's travels after the disappearance of the City of Miracles was thanks to the God of Knowledge and Wisdom passing it around through a certain method, which had convinced the magic mirror. If he really is a dragon of wisdom, it means that he was directly involved, and his level was already very high back then. His understanding of this matter definitely trumps the Groselle and Ciadas. But how do I explain the scene I divined above the grey fog? Just recalling it now makes my head ache. What I saw was definitely the ancient god, Dragon of Imagination, himself. Klein cheered up when he managed to string up all these matters together, but he also fell into a state of puzzlement. He tossed the gold coin continuously and quickly came up with some theories. Since the City of Miracles, Liveseed, was imagined, couldn't it just be imagined again after it disappeared? The original Liveseed was stuffed into the book by the Dragon King Ankwelt. Then, the one that subsequently existed was one he imagined again? This could fool all the dragons, but not the one that was known for being intelligent? If this were true, then there were actually two instances of the City of Miracles, Liveseed. The one here is the oldest one. But here comes the question. Why didn't the Dragon of Wisdom enter the book himself one? Even if he wasn't a spectator, with his title of being omniscient and omnipotent, he should have enough powers to perform a deeper exploration. He has actually been here a long time ago, but didn't alert any living beings in the book. Also, because of certain motives, he left this city of miracles here? As thoughts surfaced in Klein's mind, the star Leonard, who had both hands in his pockets, looked at him and then at Miss Justice, who had also been looking down in silence for a long time. He took the initiative to speak and break the silence. This city is grand and magnificent. It clearly doesn't belong to humans or humanoid creatures, but there's no need to stare at it for so long. You're not an architect after all. Klein gathered his thoughts and glanced at Leonard. This might very well be Dragon of Imagination Enquelt City of Miracles, Liveseed. In a sense, it's the divine kingdom of an ancient god. Of course, if there was really another Liveseed, the nature of the divine kingdom here didn't hold much importance. Divine kingdom, Leonard's pupils dilated as he repeated the keyword. Audrey regained her senses and whispered, "Is it really Liveseed?" "It's only possible." Klein had already calmed down and replied simply, "It's not floating in the air like the legends, but has sunken to the bottom of the sea of collective subconscious, so it's hard to tell if it's real or fake." At this moment, Leonard finally managed to control himself. He looked at the magnificent city in the deep-sea crater again and smiled self-deprecatingly. "I didn't expect the day when I'll come to the divine kingdom of an ancient god. Frankly, if Miss Justice wasn't here, he wouldn't have been able to help but marvel at how rich Klein's life was." Ever since he reunited with his former teammate, not only did he meet the two sons of God, kings of angels, he had also entered the mysterious book world and found a city suspected to be a divine kingdom. This was many times more interesting than what he had experienced in the past year. The level of such matters was many times higher. Of course, it was a lot more dangerous. Having said that, he looked up at the floating, seawater phantoms, and asked thoughtfully, "How do you know if the sea of collective subconscious is real or if it's imagined?" This was a continuation of the problem of determining Liveseed's authenticity. Audrey thought for a while and said with uncertainty, "There's no way to tell the difference, or rather, the sea of collective subconscious here is also real. In essence, collective subconscious is the accumulation and settling of strong emotions and feelings. Although the people in this world may be imaginary, their experiences, feelings, joy, anger, sadness, pain, and happiness, they all truly happened before." As she spoke, Audrey stopped as she vaguely realized something, but she was unable to say it out loud. At this moment, Klein suddenly said, "The objects that he can imagine will be conjured. The kingdom he dreams of will surely descend upon the physical world." As his voice echoed, Klein put away the gold coin in his hand and jumped into the deep-sea crater, his black trench coat flaring up as a result. The future that he declares will definitely be carried out, becoming reality. As his figure glided down, the following words came out. Audrey's green eyes were dazed at first before they lit up. Then, she jumped towards the city of miracles. "Aren't you going to divine the level of danger? This might be the divine kingdom of an ancient god." Leonard looked at the two of them in surprise and blurted out. In the education he received, this wasn't in line with the standard operating procedures. "When did you get the wrong impression that I didn't divine it? You just didn't notice my tiny actions. I just put away the gold coin. Also, I didn't get any warnings from my intuition for danger. Furthermore, if my theory is right, then the Dragon of Wisdom Haraburgen should have entered this place before. If there's any form of danger that W had, it would have long been finished off by him. If Miss Justice wasn't here, I'd really wish to berate you." As Klein silently lampooned, he adjusted his direction and speed, passing through a few thick stone columns that stood nearly 100 meters tall. He descended one level after another before stepping onto the grayish-white ground. He was in a spirit-body state now and could fly if he wanted to. About 2 to 3 seconds later, the silver-masked Justice Audrey landed beside him. Audrey looked up, and after reeling from a few seconds of shock due to the grandeur of the stone columns and palace, she said, "Looking from the inside and looking from a distance feels completely different. Perhaps, this is how a rat truly feels in Backlund." As she spoke, Leonard also glided over and looked sideways at Klein. It wasn't that he didn't believe in Klein, nor was he unaware of how cautious he was. He just needed to clarify such matters in a joint operation, because there was the possibility of teammates being unknowingly corrupted, turning reckless. This was a conclusion the Nighthawks gleaned from their experience of repeated sacrifices. Currently, the indications don't point to much danger, Klein said truthfully. Leonard no longer looked around and said, "The City of Miracles is really big. I mean that, for such a big city, even if we can fly, we won't be able to completely explore it without spending a few days here. Or perhaps, do you have a destination in mind?" The second half of his sentence was said while looking at Klein. Klein nodded and pointed to a huge palace that was more than 200 meters tall. "There. If I remember correctly, that is the Dragon of Imagination Anquelt's residence." This was what he saw in the dream divination. Seeing that Klein already had a plan, as if he had received Mr. Fool's guidance, Leonard felt relieved. He looked at the grayish-white foundation on his feet and said, "Is this a divine kingdom? I don't feel anything." At this moment, Audrey, who was observing the surroundings carefully, said with uncertainty, "All the abnormalities here seem to be gathering towards that palace." She was referring to the place that Klein had pointed out to be the ancient god's residence. Chapter 1071 Hall of Truth. In front of the grayish-white grand palace that was more than 200 meters tall, there were a few thick stone columns that were slightly shorter than it was, as though they were a squadron of soldiers standing at attention there. Klein could imagine that, when the City of Miracles, Liveseed, was still floating in mid-air, these stone columns would definitely have powerful dragons crouching on them. These were the servants of the ancient god. He then looked up at the open door and said to Leonard and Audrey, "Stay close to me. Once an accident happens, I'll immediately take you out of the book world and return directly above the gray fog." This was the main reason why Klein dared to explore the area. "Okay." Audrey and Leonard didn't try putting on a brave front as they walked to Klein's side and walked alongside him. Relying on their spirit body's flight ability, the trio passed the stairs and entered the palace through the exaggerated and magnificent door. The first thing they saw was a wide space that was enough for multiple dragons to roll around freely, as well as an ancient stone pillars that seemed to prop up the sky. On the two sides of the hall, there were colorful and beautiful murals. They kept extending forward and intertwining themselves with a huge pillar that was multiple arm spans wide. The giant pillar was in the deepest recesses of the hall right ahead of them. Without relying on anything else, just the pillar alone was enough to make people feel a strong sense of fear and make them experience the vicissitudes of time. It was like a fossilized deity. Almost instantly, a grayish-white figure appeared on the pillar. The figure was covered in scales, and every scale resembled a sturdy stone slab. Just the faint outline of the figure made it seem epic. Dragon of Imagination, Anquelt. Just as this thought flashed through Klein's mind, he heard an oddly familiar voice echoing in the spacious hall, Dragon of Imagination, Anquelt. As Klein looked around in astonishment, he heard Leonard sigh emotionally. The deep air listened round him as he rode, and all the low wind hardly breathed for fear. This fellow still has the mood to recite poetry, I wonder whose poem he's reciting." Klein turned to look at Leonard. Then, he heard an echo, "This fellow still has the mood to recite poetry, I wonder whose poem he's reciting." At this moment, Leonard's expression was one of shock. He shut his mouth tightly and shook his head in denial. But the next second, a voice sounded beside him, "I didn't recite anything. What's going on?" Strange. At the same moment Klein had this thought, he realized that the strangely familiar voice belonged to him. As it echoed again, repeating the thoughts that flashed through Klein's mind. Then, Audrey's gentle and mumbling voice sounded, This hall is able to let our thoughts present themselves in our surroundings, and is even able to conjure them? When I saw that huge pillar just now, I was imagining what the Dragon of Imagination Anquelt looked like. It was based on the blueprint of the mind dragon I saw before. Why is whatever I'm saying? No, indeed, the hall articulates it, so that's the case. Luckily, I didn't think of anything strange just now. Yes, reign in my thoughts, reign in my thoughts. Klein began to use cogitation to focus his mind and not let his imagination run wild. At the same time, the corresponding words echoed around him almost in sync, reign in my thoughts, so that's what Mr. World's inner world is like. He's like a child who just started school, constantly emphasizing matters that he needs to take attention of. Also, the image for his cogitation is actually layers of spherical lights. It's so beautiful. No, I'm not thinking of this. I'm not describing you like this. Mr. _world, serious thoughts kept appearing as she finally couldn't help but curl her lips. As for Leonard, the voices around him were already echoing with, ha ha ha. These two fellows. No, why am I using fellow? Be polite, be more polite. As Klein listened to his thoughts, he sighed helplessly. This place is very suitable for playing Truth or Dare. Perhaps it should be called the Hall of Truth. What game is that? Audrey didn't need to open her mouth to express her doubts. It was probably invented by Emperor Roselle. I have to be careful not to think about things I shouldn't think about. Seriously, it's too difficult to rein in random thoughts without the use of cogitation. As Klein replied, he habitually warned himself, only to have the hall ruthlessly betray him again. This time, Audrey laughed and said, Mr. World actually has such a side to him. I actually failed to read it in the past, to think you're experiencing such a day, Klein. No, what did I say? Leonard suddenly raised his right hand and covered his mouth. Unsurprisingly, he heard Miss Justice's question, Klein. And a certain someone's complaint, perhaps only turning them into marionettes can stop these fellows from having wild thoughts. Wait, what was I thinking? Phew, calm down, Klein took a deep breath and began to focus his attention on the matter itself. Let's take a look at what the murals describe. In ancient times, murals were very important methods for recording memories. They often contain plenty of information. At the same time he made the suggestion, he heard Audrey's inner thoughts laugh and think, Klein, is this Mr. World's real name? No, don't think too much about it. Mr. World will be angry. No, I think it's more likely for him to feel embarrassed. No, this is all Lai's fault. Mr. World, please believe me. Phew, calm down. Focus. Using the spectator pathway's ability to control her emotions and thoughts, Audrey gradually reined in her thoughts and cast her gaze on the mural on the right. Compared to them, Leonard's ability to control his mind was slightly weaker. There were still plenty of random thoughts resounding around him. Turning into marionettes. Is this fellow that dangerous now? TSK, so this is what's truly on your mind. Miss Justice's reaction is very interesting. I haven't seen that fellow in such an embarrassing situation in a long time. When Klein and Audrey began seriously looking at the murals and were exchanging their thoughts through the stirrings in their hearts, only then did Leonard gradually calm his thoughts and focus his attention. The mural on the right depicted historic developments. There was a scene of human construction, scenes of snow-covered plains, war and migration, various nations and cities, as well as towers and fruits that represented zero communication barriers. It was obvious that these murals started from the entrance and ended at the Dragon of Imagination's throne. Towards the end, Klein suddenly noticed a familiar figure. It was a gigantic dragon with bluish-blue eyes and ice crystal scales. It was the King of the North. You listen. The book world's development is based on these murals? As Klein's thoughts were exposed, he quickly looked back and found many blurry-faced adventurers hunting the frost dragon before opening a door to leave. The snow and ice melted before flourishing cities like Pesod appeared. They then discovered the weather turning cold, implying an end in which a new story was about to unfold. The contents of the murals will become reality in this book world? Audrey couldn't help but have such a thought. This wall, this mural looks very ordinary. It's not even as good as the works of street artists. As expected of the Dragon of Imagination's residents. Is this the power and authority of an ancient god? Leonard similarly had poignant thoughts. It's possible. Before Klein could give a more tactful reply, he heard his own voice. Let's look at the murals on the other side before putting everything together for analysis. Leonard and Audrey didn't object and followed him to the other side. During this process, they realized that even their spirit bodies couldn't fly in the palace. As the murals were huge, it didn't take much walking before the three of them could see the corresponding content. The first mural near the entrance made Klein's pupils suddenly dilate. In the mural, a giant with blurry looks, grayish-blue skin, and a single vertical was holding a hard-covered book in his hand. This, Klein heard his own shocked and hesitant voice. In the subsequent murals, the common highlight was the goatskin binding. There was a dark brown-covered book, it was obtained by the elves, the words on its surface changed, it was being put into a collection, it was obtained by different people, and it kept exchanging hands until it flew above the clouds and came to the cosmos where it landed on a gigantic claw. In the next mural, the book seemed to have nothing to do with the scenes in front. It suddenly appeared over the surface of the sea and stayed inside a blurry ship. In the penultimate mural, it was taken away by a man wearing a top hat before he left that ship. The next mural was located behind the gigantic pillar suspected to be Dragon of Imagination Enquelt's throne. It depicted that the book from before met a classic quill. At this point, all the murals came to an end. 0-08. Leonard's shocked voice echoed in the hall. The Dragon of Imagination wants to create a set with the book and quill? What will happen? When dealing with Ince Zangwill, this scene almost appeared. But ultimately, it didn't happen because the book landed in my hands, before I sacrificed it to Mr. Fool. Otherwise, Adam was already prepared against it and deliberately provided some help. Oh right, previously while inside Grozel's travels, the moment the ascetic mentioned the angel of imagination Adam, the frost dragon attacked the camp. It was because the book itself didn't allow him to finish his sentence, or had Adam heard his thoughts which became a connection for him to see and cast his gaze over, stirring up a certain reaction? Klein's thoughts wandered before sounding it out loud. During this process, he could only control himself to treat the fool as another existence. At the same time as he spoke, Audrey's thoughts appeared, the contents on this mural will become reality in the physical world? 1. Adapted from Tennyson's Godiva. Chapter 1072 The Call from Behind the Door. The contents on this mural will become reality in the physical world. Be it Klein or Leonard, they couldn't help but repeat Miss Justice's words in their hearts. If the murals on the other side determined the history of the book world, then it was only considered rather amazing. However, the discovery on this side would be enough to shake everyone's hearts and bring about a huge upheaval throughout their bodies. The pictures you depicted would definitely show up on stage in the real world, not in an illusory world. This was the performance of a deity. It's not that exaggerated, right? After Leonard repeated the statement, he whispered in a low voice, finding it hard to accept. Klein, on the other hand, started his analysis out of habit. Even if 0-08 can only affect a big city, making it difficult for it to exceed this range, a sequence one author of the spectator pathway should be similar. And the visionary's uniqueness has been confirmed to be in Adam's hands. Then what does this city of miracles rely on to guarantee that the contents on this mural will become a reality? The divine power of the Dragon of Imagination from back then? When this book was formed, the contents of the murals had already been branded into the sea of collective subconscious, sinking right inside and spreading its infection in every direction, so as to drive generation after generation to accomplish this without realizing it? If this is true, then the possibility of making another mural become a reality would definitely be nil, as the dragon of imagination has already perished, and there's no way to provide any more divine power. But we can give it a try. If the contents of the new mural really happens in the physical world, it means that this city of miracles really is Liveseed, and it contains a huge secret. It also implies that matters regarding the spectator pathway goes deeper than what I had imagined. Author? There's a potion name like that? Hearing Klein's thoughts, Leonard couldn't help but mutter. Compared to how the name, Dragon of Imagination, could be stretched to make an inference to the name, Visionary, the potion name of Author was more eye-catching. It made one's imagination run wild. It felt more like walking from reality and into the realm of fantasy. Audrey, who had long known the name of the high-sequence potions of the spectator pathway, suddenly had another thought: uniqueness. Mr. World actually managed to link up and analyze so many things in an instant. Impressive. Did I praise him too directly? Mr. World has heard it all. This hall is really hard to adapt to. No, Mr. World, I really am praising you, I really mean it. Audrey felt a little ashamed at first, but then she quickly adjusted her state of mind, trying her best to keep calm. As expected of a psychiatrist. She adjusted herself really quickly. A thought came to Klein's mind. As expected, Mr. World isn't as cold as he looks. He's the type of person who will inwardly mutter to himself I didn't say anything. Just as Audrey instinctively thought of something, she immediately denied it. The same voice echoed around Leonard: Klein's Gehrman Sparrow disguise isn't bad. Almost everyone who knows him believes that he's cold and crazy. Who would have thought? Just as Leonard's thoughts were about to wander, a voice interrupted him. Shut up. Looking at the way Gehrman Sparrow was dressed, he spread out his hands, and held back his laughter as he said, Look, that isn't cold enough, right? Cold? Then I'll directly press the unshadowed crucifix against your head. If you don't want your Beyonder characteristic, donate it to the people who need it. Without being able to use cogitation to control his thoughts, Klein instinctively retorted. Audrey looked at Mr. World and then at Mr. Star, and her heart skipped a beat. So they have so much drama in their hearts. I could only tell that was the case for Mr. Star, but I failed to read what's under the World's poker face. Giant, boss, mini. At crucial moments like this, the experienced Audrey forcibly manipulated her thoughts to begin reciting names so as to stop her thoughts from wandering off. Who are they? Leonard's attention was diverted. They're the hounds and horses my family rears, Audrey replied politely. A hound costs £450. Klein suddenly recalled Butler Walter's suggestion of buying a batch of hunting dogs when he purchased Mager Manor. Why is the first thing on Mr. World's mind the price? This question floated into Audrey's mind. Leonard pursed his lips. Even though he didn't say a word, he answered, Isn't this normal? This fellow has always been a little picky about this, I remember. Before he could finish, Klein coughed lightly and said, We'll continue exploring the other areas, and when we have time, we'll perform experiments on the murals. Sigh, this hall really complicates matters very easily. The main point is that everyone's privacy is brought to the forefront if we aren't focused. Upon hearing the last sentence of his complaint, Audrey and Leonard couldn't help but laugh out loud, but not by their own will. Seeing that Mr. World clearly didn't want the situation to develop into chaos again, Audrey raised her head, looked up at the ceiling, and focused her attention and got down to business. The mural on the right side controls the book world, and the left seems to affect reality. What if you draw the mural on the ceiling? What would happen? Klein immediately made a connection. The Dragon of Imagination's authority contains at least three aspects: an envisioned kingdom will descend upon the physical world, a declared future that will happen in the real world, and imagined objects that will be conjured. The first point corresponds to the right mural, and the second point corresponds to our guesses on the left mural. Then, could the blank spot on the palace's ceiling be related to the third authority? As long as you draw an object you imagined onto the ceiling, it will be conjured and be usable? Audrey easily understood what the world meant. Then what if I were to draw a dragon of imagination? Leonard suggested. Klein glanced at him again. First of all, you would have had to have seen the dragon of imagination without completely breaking down and losing control. Secondly, you need to restore the main details of his body. Finally, you have to know how to draw. I might not know how to now, but it doesn't mean that I can't in the future. I can hire a home tutor to teach me, Leonard grumbled in reply. And what does the main details refer to? His body structure, or the symbols and labels depicted from godhood? At this moment, Audrey pursed her lips and said, with a brisk tone, controlling herself so as to not burst out laughing, I can draw. This was the basic skill for a noble lady, and Audrey was quite talented in this aspect. Yeah, we can try it in the future when there's time. Klein nodded and walked towards the giant pillar right in front of the main hall. His plan for this expedition was to first gain a complete understanding of the situation before considering how to venture deeper. At the same time, he thought of something else because of Leonard's question, the symbols and labels from godhood. These contain plenty of mixed knowledge. It can even let people learn the corresponding potion formulas and beyonder powers after surviving the impact from witnessing it directly. Then, before the first blasphemy slate appeared, what would one obtain if they survived directly looking at a demigod or even an ancient god? There were no such things as potion formulas back then. Is it only through using a magic potion to advance one's mythical creature form step by step that the godhood aspect is able to contain this portion of knowledge? Or perhaps, after the potion formula appears, mythical creatures who used any method of advancement had the corresponding knowledge forged within them? If it's because of the two reasons I came up with, it means that the knowledge of godhood can change, and it can increase. Do angels of the Marauder pathway have the ability to alter such knowledge or even delete them directly? Mr. World's considerations are so deep and profound. They involve very high levels. Audrey couldn't help but sigh. Leonard couldn't control the voice in his heart either. There's such a thing? I should ask old man when I return. This fellow sure knows a lot. It's not entirely a pretense when he's acting as Gairman Sparrow. At least this sense of profoundness seems to belong to him. Thank you for your praise. Stop. With a small blood bottle in one hand and the unshadowed crucifix in the other, Klein forced himself to rein in his thoughts and cast his gaze at the ancient god's throne. They were in their spirit-body forms now. Although they were unable to fly due to the restrictions from the main hall, their top speed was still much faster than their human form. It was only then that Klein realized that, behind the pillar that looked like the dragon of imagination's throne, there was a dark tunnel. I can't see anything. If only there was light, a thought subconsciously flashed through Audrey's mind. Then, in that tunnel, a pure and soft light shone out, illuminating the inside of the tunnel completely. Without needing to enter, Klein, Leonard, and Audrey saw a pair of double bronze doors at the deepest end of the tunnel. There were countless indescribable symbols covering the door, like countless chains that extended behind them, as if they were sealing something. It gave off a heavy and mysterious feeling. In the city of miracles of the dragons, in the residence of an ancient god, there was apparently a sealed door behind his throne. Almost at the same time, the three of them seemed to look through the bronze door and into the darkness inside. Following that, they heard the loud thumping of hearts. It was from their own heartbeats. Yet, they were in their spirit-body states now, so there was no such thing as a heart. After that, the bronze-green color on the surface of the unshadowed crucifix slowly peeled off, revealing a corporeal body formed from pure light that emitted a sun-like glow. As for Klein, Audrey, and Leonard, they felt a baffling sense of coldness. It was as if every cell had their own sentience and wanted to form another self. In their illusory vision, in the darkness behind the bronze door, an eye opened. Its pupil was dark, filled with ghostly blue cracks. One after another, similar-looking eyes opened too. They were densely packed together and wore a cold gaze that stared intently at them. At this moment, Klein and the others seemed to hear a silent calling. It was an extremely attractive shout. Without any hesitation, Klein's spirit body burgeoned and enveloped Leonard and Audrey. He ended the summoning and returned above the grey fog. Chapter 1073 Three Possibilities. As he returned to the world above the grey fog, Klein felt the coldness in his body rapidly dissipate. There were no more worms of spirit trying to give birth to new consciousnesses. A moment later, the mottled long bronze table appeared in front of him. He saw that Miss Justice and Leonard's spirit bodies were gradually becoming clearer amidst the thin grey fog, although they still maintained a certain blurriness to them. After the grey fog swirled around them and sank into the ground, Klein asked, "How are you feeling now?" He used German Sparrow's usual tone, but he immediately recalled how his inner grumblings, inner thoughts, habitual analysis, and him dissing Leonard had been exposed. He was no longer able to maintain his image in front of Miss Justice. "It's all Leonard's fault. Sigh, as per the doctor's advice, not only did I not wear a thick mask this time, but I even removed the thin kind." This thought flashed in his mind unconsciously as he cut off his thoughts and warily glanced around. He still hadn't gotten rid of the fear of having his thoughts spoken out loud. Luckily, this was no longer the place that he had named the Hall of Truth. There were no more magical powers that he couldn't defend again via normal means. It was obvious that Audrey and Leonard also had a similar trauma due to their post-traumatic stress. One of them suddenly pursed her lips, while the other sat up straight, as though they had instinctively thought of something. After a few seconds of silence, they then remembered that the world had asked about their situation, so they quickly turned their attention back on the right track. "I feel like something was being purified. I had the illusion that I would dissociate into a second personality. No, it wasn't a second personality, it seemed like a consciousness that didn't belong to me was awakening inside my body. Yes, it's now gone. Praise be to Mr. Fool." Audrey rather professionally did a psychoanalysis on herself before sincerely expressing her gratitude. "I can openly accept such gratitude." That was a dangerous thought. Thankfully, Miss Justice's and Leonard's thoughts didn't steer towards the Fool while inside the Hall of Truth. Otherwise, I'd definitely not be able to resist the urge to reply. That'd spell the end of me. My sense of shame will cause me to lose control on the spot, breaking down into a clump of worms of spirit. Klein's thought flashed as he seriously replied, "Praise be to Mr. Fool. Praise be to Mr. Fool." As a believer of the Evernight Goddess, Leonard hesitantly echoed and quickly changed the topic. "There's nothing wrong with me too. Just now, I felt something calling me from behind the bronze door. What about you?" Seeing that Leonard had confirmed his condition, Klein placed the unshadowed crucifix and the metal bottle containing his blood onto the long, mottled table in front of him. "I felt the same way too," he answered with certainty. "Me too. It wasn't an illusion. I did an analysis on my own mind," Audrey said in a very clear and certain tone. Leonard held his chin and said, "What could that be?" It actually needed an ancient god to seal it behind his throne. After what had happened before, he felt that he no longer had much of an image in front of Miss Justice, so his posture became more casual. "We can try analyzing this." Audrey carefully glanced at the world. She had a deep impression of this gentleman's ability to gather information, make connections, complete an analysis, and infer the information in a short period of time. Klein thought for a moment and said without any inclinations, "There are only three possibilities. 1. It's a powerful creature from the second epoch of the real world. It's at least close to sequence 0, and the dragon of imagination Ankwelt had sealed it behind his throne and beneath the City of Miracles live seed. However, I don't think that's very likely. This is because that ancient god definitely had his reasons for creating this book and stuffing liveseed into it while affecting the book world and the real world. It's unlikely he would place an unpredictable element in here for prolonged periods of time. Yeah, we all know that we have to eliminate possible accidents. What's more, an ancient god. Audrey nodded slightly and began to discuss seriously with the world Gehrman. At this moment, Leonard chuckled and said, perhaps an ancient god like the Dragon of Imagination had seen certain scenes of the distant future and believes that the sealed item will help him achieve his goals? That's why I said that it's not impossible, but it's highly improbable, Klein replied calmly. The second possibility is that the sealed item is key to the Dragon of Imagination Anquelt's ploy. Once this book and 0-08 meet, the seal will be released and that object will return to the real world and bring about certain changes. I believe that this theory has the highest possibility. Amongst them, perhaps it also involves the Dragon of Wisdom's true attitude or intent. Then what could it be? Mr. Fool once said that, after Adam obtained 0-08, he is even closer to being divine. The times have changed as a result. Does this mean that Adam has gathered all the ingredients for visionary and is just short of the ritual? Is there anything wrong with my understanding? Audrey shared her point of view. I'm not sure either. I'll pray to Mr. Fool and see if I can get a clearer revelation. Klein didn't want to give a firm answer. Unfortunately, Old Man is an angel from the fourth epoch and doesn't know much about the second epoch, but he isn't unfamiliar with Adam. The star Leonard thoughtfully said, I'll try. He wanted to say that he would try investigating, but upon recalling that the two knew his secret, he gave up such thoughts and directly said, try asking Old Man. Sorry to trouble you, Audrey sincerely thanked him. From her point of view, this was a matter regarding the spectator pathway. The person most concerned about this was undoubtedly herself, while others were merely providing help. Then she said, the third possibility is that there is some sort of object or monster sealed inside the book world? Yes, it might be closely related to the book world, and destroying it might cause the book world to collapse. Therefore, all Anquelt did was seal it. Klein shared his theory. Audrey thought for a while before saying, I have an idea regarding this possibility. Seeing Mr. World and Mr. Star cast their gazes over, awaiting an answer, she slowed down her pace and said, I'm considering it from a psychological perspective. Since that book world was created by Anquelt's envisioning it, the sea of collective subconscious there would definitely be formed as a result of him. It would have his psyche, emotions, and feelings branded into it. Perhaps the City of Miracles, Liveseed, seals the most extreme parts of these things. They're the trauma or fears of the Dragon of Imagination. Some terrifying matters from his one consciousness might be projected onto this brand. As long as he cannot defeat them, and if it hasn't been dealt with in the real world, the book world sea of collective subconscious cannot be destroyed and can only be sealed. If it's ignored, they will slowly contaminate the sea of collective subconscious and make the development of history deviate from its intended path. Leonard was more focused than when he attended Red Glove's meetings. He couldn't help but mention when he had heard that, as an ancient god that ruled the sky and the mind, what could have left an irremovable trauma and create such an intense sense of fear? I don't know. Audrey shook her head frankly. If it's just a psychological analysis, since it's sealed under the throne and at the bottom of the City of Miracles, and is reached by a tunnel, it means that the source of the trauma and fear comes from underground. Therefore, the Dragon of Imagination sealed it. No, he isolated the mental projection coming from underground. Otherwise, why wouldn't it be beside the throne, in the depths of the hall, in a specially created jail, or somewhere else? Upon hearing Miss Justice's words, Klein instantly thought of what had happened to Miss Magician and Miss Judgment. According to the information provided by the Sanguine, they found an ancient castle of unknown age. At the bottom of the castle was a bronze door that seemed to seal something terrifying that came from underground. Once they approached the door or stayed in its vicinity for too long, they would be corrupted, dying a tragic death. It was an ancient castle that was built to defend against something unknown. It was originally guarded by humans from an unknown era. After the Sanguine discovered it, no one dared to enter. Back then, I thought that it might be related to devils and that one needed to be a demigod in order to explore it. Could this be related to the seal in Liveseed? Klein's thoughts wandered as he quickly found the relevant information from his memories. On the way to the ruins of the Battle of the Gods on Catlia's future, he met a so-called deep-sea well. At that time, the future's sailor, Nina, had dived to the bottom of the sea and did a series of investigations. She said that it wasn't a giant well. It was deep and dark, impossible for a human child to enter. The bottom couldn't be seen, and there were strange honeycomb signs of corrosion along the inner walls. Surrounding it were collapsed iron buildings. In a sense, this is also a tunnel that goes deep underground. Klein looked around and deliberated before saying, "Do you remember the matter Miss Magician mentioned? Under an abandoned castle in Delaire Forest, there is a pair of doors that seals a powerful corruptive force." Ah, right. Audrey instantly recalled the past. Could it be that in the early days of the Second Epoch, in that ancient era, supernatural beings had some common, terrifying enemy that came from underground? Perhaps. Klein couldn't give an affirmative answer, so he took the opportunity to say, "It might also be like the many predictions of the apocalypse which state that the danger comes from the cosmos." Yeah. Audrey and Leonard didn't know much about such matters, so they couldn't discuss this matter too deeply. Let's end it here for today. After we have a preliminary understanding of the situation, we will try to experiment on the murals. Also, remember to keep this a secret. Klein shot a look at Leonard and said, "Oh, after you return, pray to Mr. Fool and request that he be the witness to our vows to not divulge each other's secrets." Audrey didn't object and added, "I'll use hypnosis here to forget certain matters here to prevent myself from remembering it when I return." Chapter 1074 The answer to questions. After Audrey and Leonard left the grey fog, Klein didn't immediately return to the real world. He was still sitting on the high-back chair that belonged to the world, silent for more than 10 seconds. Then, he beckoned for an item. It was a heart that was the size of a child's fist, one that full of grayish-white wrinkles, a manipulator's Beyonder characteristic. Holding the Beyonder characteristic, Klein stood up and walked out of the majestic palace. He entered the depths of the mysterious space above the grey fog and arrived at the staircase of light that seemed to lead to a divine kingdom. Walking along the stairs, he walked up to the floating grayish-white clouds and stood in front of the strange door of light and the hanging transparent cocoons. Klein raised his right hand, lifting the brain-like, heart-like manipulator Beyonder characteristic to his chest and extended his spirituality, hoping to use it. He wanted to see if there were still any subconscious thoughts in the people inside the cocoons. He wanted to see if they had put together a miniature sea of collective subconscious. If that happened, he planned to use Vin Rambise's manipulator Beyonder characteristic to enter the consciousness and check on the psyche branding to figure out what the people who had been hanging above the door of light had experienced before their transmigration. He wanted to know if they sensed anything during that long slumber. This was the inspiration that the expedition today gave him. Of course, the Beyonder characteristic left behind by Vin Rambis might not be able to help Klein do what he wanted. It was because it hadn't been made into a mystical item, and it was very difficult to use effectively. In an instant, the grayish-white and wrinkled heart in Klein's hand started to beat slowly as it emitted thumping sounds. Klein then heard the synchronized heartbeats among the transparent cocoons. Thump. Thump. This meant that the people inside were still alive, only in a certain state of slumber. In Klein's vision, their figures gradually evolved into several blurry islands beneath them. This represented their consciousness. However, these spiritual islands were also trapped within transparent cocoons, separating them from the prying eyes of the outside world. Similarly, they were unable to integrate and create a sea of collective subconscious. Unless the cocoon is destroyed, there's no way to bypass them and enter the corresponding mind world. Klein muttered to himself and lowered the hand holding the manipulator beyonder characteristic. After a few seconds, he sighed deeply and turned around to leave. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Earl Hall. With the silk blanket over her, Audrey, who was sleeping soundly with her eyes closed, suddenly opened her eyes. She then sat up, moved to the side of the bed, and prayed sincerely to Mr. Fool, asking him to witness her vow to secrecy. After she was done with this matter, she pulled a pillow over and placed it behind her waist, reminiscing over the experiences that she had yet to forget during the exploration. The history of ancient times is really interesting and terrifying. Mr. Starr's performance is similar to my usual observations of him. He's more carefree and casual, and his thoughts easily wander in an uncontrollable manner. Yet, there are matters where he shows his experience and acuity. He's rather reliable. This isn't a contradiction, as many people have such mixed layers to themselves. Mr. World is indeed a gentle person. He doesn't seem to wear much of an expression on his face, but he's secretly inwardly muttering something to himself all the time. His mental conversations with Mr. Starr can practically be adapted into a play. People call him a crazy adventurer who doesn't care about his surroundings, one that directly draws his gun to shoot when he sees a target. Well, at the last moment, I thought he would attempt to approach the bronze door, but in the end, he fled. No, he broke away so decisively. Audrey's lips slowly curled up when she thought of this. Then, she made a conclusion. The facts have proven that, in the mysterious world, unless one has completely lost all sense of rationality or has given up on thinking, there will not be any beyonders who will really do crazy things. One has to be careful and cautious, not seeing things that shouldn't be seen, and not hear things that shouldn't be heard. Audrey, you must remember this. 7 Pinster Street. Leonard returned to his body. He quickly thought of how he should talk to Palaz Zoroast before pretending like nothing had happened and saying in a deep voice, "Old man, I have something to ask you." In his mind, Palaz's slightly aged voice immediately laughed. "You have to remember this. The more you ask, the more I can guess what you did tonight. It's not like there's anything that needs to be kept a secret," Leonard replied habitually before getting down to the main issue. "Old man, what do you know about the Amon's brother?" "That depends on what you want to know." Palaz Zoroast tossed the question back at Leonard. Leonard thought for a moment and said, "After Amon's brother obtained 0-08, is he only short of the ritual to become a god?" "Probably." Palaz didn't give an affirmative answer. Leonard wasn't too satisfied with this answer. Instead, he said, "I remember you mentioning it once. In the early stages of the Solomon Empire, the 2 kings of angels, Medici and Ouroboros, were quite scared of Amon and his brother. This means that they were already very close to being divine." This was something that Palaz had occasionally mentioned during their previous exchanges. This time, Leonard had confirmed it from some of Mobit's answers. I've only said the first half of the sentence. I didn't tell you that Amon and Adam are very close to being divine." Palaz rejected Leonard's claim. "There are too many possibilities as to why Medici and Ouroboros are afraid. It's not just because he is close to being divine. It's not enough to make such a conclusion based on that." The sequence one angel cleared his throat and continued, "Them being close to being divine is one of the possibilities. Adam and Amon wield unique authorities, and them being hard to deal with is another possibility. For instance, you will always have no idea that Adam is sitting beside you. You have no idea if what you're doing was arranged by him, nor do you know that you're walking into his trap by your own volition. I'm referring to you, not me. Of course, I also have to be aware of such matters. Letting my guard down might result in terrible consequences for me too. As for Amon, he has many different ideas and has a do-it spirit, making it hard for people to guess his motives and be on guard against him. Besides, he is very good at deceit. There's always some conspiracy behind him. In that era, apart from the true deities, there was no one who wasn't afraid of him. Even true deities had to be wary of him, otherwise, they might have certain authorities stolen by him at some point in time. Leonard nodded indecemably and diverted the topic. Old man, do you think the spectator pathway is hiding any secrets? I don't think there are any secrets below the level of angel. I'm not sure of anything above it. Pallas said after pondering for a few seconds. Without waiting for Leonard to respond, he hesitantly added, I heard from Medici that high-level beyonders of the spectator pathway are the hardest to lose control or go crazy, but it's also the easiest to lose control and go crazy. Why? Leonard asked in surprise. Pallas Zoroast scoffed and said, I have some guesses, but I lack the necessary evidence and logic behind them. I don't want to tell you for the time being. You actually don't have any ideas or theories, right? Leonard habitually grumbled. Don't try your little tricks in front of me. The slightly aged voice wasn't affected at all. Leonard didn't dare to ask further as he deliberated for a moment before saying, Old man, I went to a real dream this time. There were quite a lot of psyche remnants of people from ancient times in it. Do you know a viscount named Mobit Zoroast? Mobit, Pallas' voice suddenly aged significantly before returning to normal. He's a direct descendant of my bloodline. He vanished after a large-scale war, and I thought that he had been killed by Ammon or Jacob in passing, causing me to fail to divine the murderer. From the looks of it, things weren't that simple. Indeed. Leonard gave an affirmative answer. Then, he briefly provided the gist of things. He's been dead for some time, leaving some of his psyche behind. In that real dream, he married a songster from the elves. After listening quietly, Pallas said after a while, That's good, too. Leonard had originally wanted to mention that Mobit also addressed Pallas as old man, but he suddenly couldn't bring himself to. He had no choice but to end the conversation there. After witnessing Leonard's and Audrey's vow, Klein returned to the real world. He tidied up the altar in the room, took out a pen and paper, and drew a complicated symbol that was a mixture of concealment and mystery prying. He wanted to summon a Rhodes to ask how it had confirmed that Grozel's travels had appeared after the disappearance of the City of Miracles, Liveseed. After waiting for more than 10 seconds, the full-body mirror in the room lit up with a faint aqueous light. Silver words appeared one after another in the dim light: exalted, benevolent, great master, your puny, loyal, and humble servant, a Rhodes, is here to answer your summoning. Do you have any orders for me? Some questions. After giving his answer, Klein was in no hurry to ask about the matter regarding Grozel's travels, intending to start with something that wasn't very sensitive first. He thought and said, a Rhodes, there's an abandoned castle in Delaire Forest. In the depths of it is a pair of bronze doors. It seems to be sealing some power coming from underground. Do you know what it is? The moment he finished speaking, the light on the full-body mirror's surface suddenly dimmed and turned pitch black. In the pitch blackness, white, liquefied words appeared one after another. I came from underground. Chapter 1075. No response. I came from underground. Looking at the ghastly white words that appeared on the full-body mirror, a chill suddenly ran down Klein's back. His pupils dilated as he instinctively wanted to switch places with his marionette next door. In the room where the valet was, Anuni, who was lying quietly, had opened his eyes. His stomach began to expand and contract as though he had a second heart, one that beat extremely slowly. At the same time, the scene of the magic mirror, a Rhodes, answering where it came from flashed through Klein's mind. Large amounts of black sticky liquid spewed out from an underground hole, writhing and expanding. An uneven number of hands and legs that turned into numerous monsters grew out. During this process, a speck of light was shot out along with the black liquid before landing on a rock, to which it rapidly fused together, turning into a mirror with ancient patterns and black gems adorning its two sides, Rhodes's main form. It really came from underground. And this underground is the same as the underground area sealed by the bronze door inside the ancient abandoned castle. I didn't make the connection before. It's not like I could help it. There are just too many things that involve things from underground. Most of them have little special meaning, just like coal. A few days ago, I didn't think that there was anything overly special with the underground. Klein controlled the urge within him and ignored the shock from Rhodes's answer, and he said with an unperturbed expression, "What's the exact situation?" The ghastly pale words changed and gave off a baffling feeling, as though it was almost crying. "Great Master, I'm not exactly sure what happened. I only came to the surface and became a mirror before I gained true sentience. I don't remember anything from before." "Oh yeah, there's something that might be related. Do you want to hear it?" "Speak." Seeing that Rhodes's attitude was still all right, Klein heaved a sigh of relief. The color of the words on the full-body mirror's surface had slightly recovered, and it became somewhat pure white. "Didn't I say it before? I see support and dominance from you, and other than that special calling, I have similar feelings towards the underground. It makes me feel warm and makes me want to return to submit myself. This might be why I became your servant." "What? The things from underground give people the same feeling as the gray fog? They all involve support and dominance?" Upon seeing Rhodes's answer, Klein jumped in fright once again. If not for his clown's ability, he would have lost his composure. At that moment, he suddenly recalled a Chinese joke he had seen in his previous life and substituted himself into it. "What? The things that the ancient gods fear come from underground? What? Rhodes also comes from underground? What? I also come from underground? This is really funny and scary. No, this might not be a joke." The original owner of the mysterious space above the gray fog, the creator of that strange door of light, the existence that pulled all the transmigrators over, might be related to the underground, or he has all kinds of connections with it. Klein's thoughts wandered as he instantly thought of many matters. As an indescribable shadow loomed over him, he smiled and mocked himself. No matter what, there are new clues and directions for the investigation into the gray fog and transmigration. Klein composed himself and asked in deliberation, "What do the churches and secret organizations know about the underground objects that require sealing?" On the full-length mirror, the white words returned to its silver color. "It's almost unheard of. It seems to be concealed by some sort of power." "Isn't that concealment?" Klein frowned slightly and didn't say a word. The silver words on the mirror continued to appear. "However, there are some legends that exist within a group of secret organizations. According to the legends, the underground is described as the lair of devils and evil spirits, the source of humanity's decadence, the primordial sins and evil. The first one is wrong. The underground object that needs to be sealed has a high chance of having nothing to do with devils or evil spirits. Legends are actually similar to the mysterious symbols. Don't look at what is said, but peel off its outer skin and figure out what it symbolizes. This symbolizes the fear of the underground, from the body to the spirit, from one's consciousness to one's feelings." Klein's thoughts raced as he said with a nod, "It's your turn to ask a question." "Great Master, your loyal servant, Rhodes, has a small suggestion. Do you want to hear it?" Silver words appeared on the full-body mirror one after another. "Speak." Klein could vaguely guess what Rhodes was suggesting. "Before you return to being divine, try not to investigate anything related to being sealed underground." The silver words quickly squirmed, reforming into a new sentence. "As expected." Klein sighed and calmly said, "Next question. How did you confirm that Grozel's travels appeared after the disappearance of the City of Miracles, Liveseed?" The words on the surface of the mirror quickly distorted, merging into a clump, and then quickly dispersing. it's a revelation and information obtained from the spirit world, since it originated from the dragon's subsidiary god, the dragon of wisdom. Your loyal servant believes that it can be confirmed. Great Master, is there a problem with that? How direct? After sighing, Klein instantly thought of how the dragon of wisdom, Haraburgen, should have entered the book world before and approached the bronze door behind the ancient god's throne, likely having some knowledge of what was sealed underground due to his omniscience. Furthermore, Klein believed that the ancient dragon had hidden a deeper layer of secrets in Grozel's travels. He could vaguely grasp it, but he couldn't tell what it was and grasp at it. No, Klein answered Rhodes's question. Then, he probed, why didn't you mention the dragon of wisdom's true name? It's because I don't dare to directly give the name of a god. Rhodes gave a confirmed answer in a tacit manner. Klein nodded and didn't ask further. It's your turn. Great Master, do you have any more questions? The silver word rapidly reorganized itself on the slightly dark mirror. No, that's all for today. Klein shook his head. With that said, he remembered what had happened the previous time and added, I'll summon you again when there are new questions. The full-body mirror immediately brightened, and the silver words sparkled, Yes, Master. Your loyal and strong servant, Rhodes, is waiting for you to call again. This time, it wasn't a simple drawing but a white cat's paw with a red center. There's always something new. The corner of Klein's mouth twitched slightly as he watched the full-body mirror the bedroom return to normal. He stood in the darkness, bathed in the crimson moonlight shining through the curtains. After standing quietly for a while, he returned to his bed and quickly fell asleep with the help of cogitation. The next morning, on Monday morning, Klein woke up 15 minutes earlier than usual. He led his valet, Ennuni, down to the first floor and said to butler Walter, I had a nightmare last night. I want to visit the cathedral before breakfast. Although butler Walter was surprised by this, it wasn't too strange. After all, as long as the cathedral's doors were open, people could enter at any time. He quickly arranged for a carriage and sent Dwayne Dantes all the way to the door. When Klein arrived at St. Samuel Cathedral, the door wasn't opened yet. He waited until 8 before entering the main hall with the first batch of believers. He found a seat in the first few pews and sat down facing the dark sacred emblem. Closing his eyes in the tranquil environment, he focused on chanting the goddess's honorific name in ancient Hermes. The Evemite goddess who stands higher than the cosmos and more eternal than eternity. You are also the Lady of Crimson, the Mother of Concealment, the Empress of Misfortune and Horror, Mistress of Repose and Silence. After he finished reciting the honorific name, he changed to his normal lone language and said almost soundlessly, There's an ancient castle in the middle of Delaire Forest. There's an ancient bronze door deep within it. It's sealing a powerful corruptive force. How should I eliminate this latent problem there? This wasn't a test of a deity, but an open report. As for what reaction the church would have after that, and what they would see through their operations, was a whole other matter. After repeating it 7 times, he began to pray seriously. Time passed. In the quiet and peaceful church, Klein stood up and walked out of St. Samuel Cathedral with his valet, Ennuni. During this process, he didn't receive any revelations, nor did he see the matron of the Evernight cloister, Ariana. The feedback itself meant something. That was he wasn't qualified to know about the underground seal. East Borough, in a 2-bedroom apartment. Furs pulled up the blanket and covered her head. She abhorred the curtains here because they were too thin and translucent and couldn't block out the morning sun. That seriously affected her quality of sleep. I have to change it. No, we might have to move again soon. Just as Furz's thoughts wandered about, she heard the sound of the bedroom door opening and Zio's familiar gate. In a flash, her blanket disappeared and a letter landed on her. Your letter, from Pritz Harbor, Zio informed her. Teacher's reply. Furz sat up suddenly, opened the letter, and quickly read it. After a moment of silence, she said, I have to go out for a while. My teacher has already reached Backlund. This letter should have arrived 2 days ago. The letter had a date and address. The postman over here isn't that responsible. Xiao glanced at her friend and said, "Will you be late?" Fortunately, teacher said that he would wait 3 days for me. Furs hurriedly got off the bed and started changing her clothes. She had a feeling that she would be able to understand the Abraham family more deeply this time, and also receive the potion formula of Traveler and some Beyonder ingredients. Chapter 1076 Dorian's Request Outside Room 2016 at the Hat Trick Inn on Sherwood Burrows 22 Hope Street. Furs directly walked through the wall without drawing anyone's attention. Then, she knocked on the door in a rhythm that was previously agreed upon. Not long after, Dorian Gray Abraham, who was dressed in black, with his broad shoulders and thick arms, unlocked the door and turned the doorknob. The gentleman quickly sized up the area and made way for Furs to enter the room. "I really didn't expect you to become a scribe so soon." After closing the door, Dorian carefully examined the door's lock before turning around and sighing. Based on the standards of this era, he was considered a middle-aged man, but he was still a Sequence 7 astrologer. He had no hope of advancing yet. His student, Furs Wall, took about a year to go from Sequence 9 to Sequence 6. This comparison between the two made Dorian feel poignant and sad. The Abraham family's bloodline should have been noble and enviable, but now, it was a heavy curse that made him depressed. "It's because you taught me well." Although Furs didn't like going out and enjoyed staying at home, she would still be invited by the nobles from time to time. She was a best-selling author who participated in high society's literary salons, so she wasn't clueless as to how to speak. Furthermore, she had indeed obtained quite a bit of help from her teacher, from providing knowledge and money to formulas and ingredients. Dorian looked at her and shook his head with a smile. "It's not like you're my only student. As far as I remember, this advancement speed can only be matched by one person." He paused and continued, "Next up, your target is Sequence 5 Traveler. And I have even higher expectations for you. I hope that you can obtain godhood and become a Sequence 4 secret sorcerer. Of course, I also have a request. When you truly become a demigod, try to pray to a hidden existence and listen to his answer to figure out what he is talking about. This is indeed a bit dangerous, but a Sequence 4 demigod would have sufficient power to withstand it. Without any other elements at play, there shouldn't be any problems." "Teacher, is this answer important to you?" Although Furs knew what was going on, she still acted curious and puzzled. Dorian fell silent for a few seconds before sighing, "It's very important. My parents, my brothers, my sisters, my children, too many people have sacrificed their lives in pursuit of this answer, but to no avail. Don't worry. We paid such a huge price because there's an ancient curse on our family's bloodline, and you aren't related to us by blood. I don't expect to find a way to break the curse through that answer during my generation. However, I hope to know where it originates from and understand the cause of my death." Upon saying this, Dorian took a deep breath and didn't continue. For some reason, Furs could feel the weight of time that had accumulated over 1,000 years, generation after generation, bearing down on her shoulders. She really couldn't imagine how painful it would be for a person's ancestors, parents, brothers, sisters, and children to directly or indirectly die from the same curse. Thinking of how well her teacher had been taking care of her, Furs, who had only received this type of care from her elders, opened her eyes, lowered her head, and nodded. "I'll try my best." Dorian held back his feelings and nodded slightly. "The most praiseworthy trait of yours is your kindness." Furs felt a little embarrassed as she turned to talk about a phrase the teacher had mentioned. Family? She remembered that her teacher had never told her about the Abraham family. He had claimed that he, Lawrence, and Elisa were members of a secret organization. In order to differentiate between matters which her teacher had told her and what she had learned at the Tarot Club, Furs had done a serious list of what she should know before she left home, to prevent herself from accidentally revealing information she shouldn't have. Dorian answered simply, in order to solve the curse, everyone in my family joined that organization. He immediately changed the subject. Why did you move out in a hurry this time? I was targeted by official Beyonders. Furs first said a half-truth before complaining a little about the mailman. Dorian didn't say anything else as he stepped away from Furs and set up a ritual. He summoned the music-loving void creature, Malmouth, and he made it spit out 3 items. One was a transparent, nearly illusory crystal, and the second item was a piece of ancient goatskin parchment. The third was a small hunter's backpack. This is a Beyonder characteristic left behind by a traveler. With it, you don't need to gather any additional main ingredients. This is the traveler potion formula. This backpack contains the corresponding supplementary ingredients. If you don't have a good way to preserve them, try your best to finish digesting the scribe potion within half a year. Otherwise, their spirituality will be completely lost. Dorian handed everything over to Furs. Thank you, teacher, Furs said sincerely. Then, she unfurled the goatskin and quickly skimmed through the potion formula before placing her focus on the ritual. Set up special coordinates in 4 completely different spots deep in the spirit world which are all set up extremely far away from each other. The goal of this ritual is? Furs thought for a few seconds and asked her teacher. After consuming the traveler potion, you will wander the spirit world chaotically. When you grasp some degree of initial level over your powers, you will realize that you have lost your way. At that moment, you can use the 4 special coordinates to return to the real world. Otherwise, you will be trapped in the depths of the spirit world for a long time. Not only is it dangerous inside, but it will also assimilate you, making you lose your mind and become a living creature that is attached to the spirit world. Although Dorian had no hope of becoming a traveler, he had seen students advancing to sequence 5 before. Then there should be another alternative, Furs muttered in thought. Yes. Dorian nodded and said, previously, there was something in the organization that could allow people to instantly return to the real world from the spirit world. Unfortunately, it was lost. Without waiting for Furs to ask, Dorian said, if you really become a demigod and fulfill my wish, I'll hand over an important item that I'm in charge of to you. This is an expectation your teacher has for you. One of the powerful sealed artifacts of the Abraham family? Furs had a vague guess, but she didn't dare promise anything. She said the same thing, I'll try my best. Following that, she asked curiously, teacher, you mentioned that sequence 4 is a secret sorcerer. What about sequence 3, 2, and sequence 1? Dorian immediately laughed. You're only a sequence 6. Yes, sequence 3's name is Wanderer. Sequence 2 is Planeswalker, and the sequence 1 potion name is Key of Stars. Haha, it's a good thing that you mentioned this. I actually forgot to organize a list of things to take note of in the spirit world. These are things that must be remembered after becoming a traveler. In that case, I'll stay for another night. You can visit me tomorrow for the documents. As Furs ruminated over the names of the high-sequence potions of the apprentice pathway, she agreed. All right, teacher. After settling these matters, Dorian paced back and forth and thought for a moment before instructing. The Beyonder characteristics of the same pathway have a certain attraction towards each other. It's not obvious when one's at a low sequence, but the higher the sequence, the stronger it becomes. Sometimes, this kind of attraction isn't something you can directly feel, while also making you unknowingly approach a high-sequence Beyonder of the same pathway. When you become a traveler, you have to pay attention to this matter. At this point, Dorian paused and said, not many demigods of the apprentice pathway are still alive. Among them, you need to be extra careful of a man named Bodis. He is the saint of secrets from the Aurora Order and, just like Lewis, he's a traitor of our organization. I will give you his portrait tomorrow. Bodhi's. Furs repeated the name her teacher had mentioned in her mind. At the same time, she had a new understanding about the Aurora Order Oracle, Louis Veen, over the previous chance encounter. Perhaps it wasn't a chance encounter, but the attraction force between Beyonder characteristics. Teacher had a sufficiently powerful sealed artifact from the apprentice pathway on him. Furs quickly suppressed this thought and began asking for advice on how to act as a scribe. In the Berg household in the City of Silver, there's actually a path that can bypass the front of the giant king's court and enter the interior from the waning forest and barren tunnel. Derek Berg recalled the information he had been shared by Mr. World above the grey fog. This was very important to the City of Silver, as the early-stage explorations after the afternoon town camp had set off implied that the closer they were to the giant king's court, the stronger the monsters that originated from the darkness were. I have to tell the chief. Derek abruptly stood up and rushed out of his house, heading straight for the spire. As he wished, he saw the chief of the 6-member council, Colin Iliad. He followed Mr. Hanged Man's instructions and said that he had recalled some murals he had seen in the afternoon town's shadow. On it was a secret passage that led into the giant king's court. Colin Iliad listened quietly without interrupting Derek's narration. Finally, he nodded gently and said, "Good, you did well. What do you want to exchange for this contribution?" A mature mind dragon's complete brain. Derek was prepared. Colin didn't ask why as he thought for a moment and said, "If that secret passage is real, then the value will definitely exceed the complete brain of an adult mind dragon." You can pick something else. Are you interested in the potion formula for a relatively higher sequence of the plantar pathway? This is a question for Mr. Fool. While Derek was enlightened, he said in surprise, "Do we have a relatively higher sequence potion formula for the plantar pathway?" He had no recollection of it. Of course. You should remember that the giant king's queen is the goddess of harvest, but the surrounding areas lack the corresponding Beyonder ingredients. There's no rush. You can think about it again. Colin Iliad calmly changed the subject. Are you skilled with your Priest of Light powers? Yes, Derek replied succinctly. Colin was silent for a moment as he looked at the adolescent child before him and said, "What kind of saint-level sealed artifact do you want to choose?" Chapter 1077 4 Choices. What kind of saint-level sealed artifact do I want to choose? Derek Berg subconsciously considered what he needed. Due to the fact that the sun pathway was rather powerful against the monsters in the darkness, and with Thunder God's roar, he didn't have the desire for sealed artifacts that provided offensive or supportive effects. Instead, the pain from being beaten up while making friends made him subconsciously hope to obtain a mystical item that could provide stronger defensive capabilities. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Derek suddenly realized that the question wasn't directed at the saint-level sealed artifact he wanted, but which saint-level sealed artifact could be used to exchange for the Creator's cross from Mr. Fool. He hesitated and frankly asked, "Your Excellency, do you have any suggestions?" Colin glanced at him and left his original position. He slowly walked to the window and turned around. There are 4 sealed artifacts that are relatively suitable for you. The first item is called Sword of Silver Dawn. It was left behind by an elder who died 1300 years ago. With this sword in hand, one can hide their malicious intent and certain actions, effectively interfering with divination and prophecy. They would obtain an exaggerated amount of strength and bring to their surroundings a dawn that can resist evil and degeneration. It can also stir up a powerful destructive hurricane of light. It can create an invisible and sturdy defensive wall around the wielder. Every time it connects to the land, its defensive strength will be unshakable. At the tip of the hilt is a single-eyed, huge-mouthed head engraving with living characteristics. Feeding the corresponding herbs, essential oils, and medicine to this engraving will give the Sword of Silver Dawn different effects. For example, lightning strike, freeze, purification, decay, and exorcism. This sword has strict requirements for its usage. It's impossible to lift up if one isn't at least 180 centimeters tall. Below 200 centimeters, it will be hard to unleash its full strength. In addition, the head engraving at the hilt is very fond of talking. It's always talking non-stop. If the wielder doesn't respond, the Sword of Silver Dawn might suddenly give up resisting at a critical moment and even attack its owner. If the wielder is willing to converse with the head engraving, they will be pushed to the edge of madness. This is what I want, a sealed artifact that's good at defense. Derek muttered to himself. He didn't interrupt the chief's explanation as he quietly listened to him introduce the other sealed artifacts. The second is Twilight Mask. This is from the first chief. It's a mask made from a skull. It can hide any malicious intent, thoughts, and inclinations. It makes the wearer feel like a dead person without any thoughts. As long as one puts on this mask, one will possess the power of a real giant and have control over the undead. Any living creature that looks directly into the eyes of the wearer will immediately die. Even those that possess godhood will be seriously injured. And even without any direct eye contact, the target of the wearer will slowly wither away as if they were floating across a river of death. The person wearing this mask can also create a terrifying twilight storm. Any item stained with the dim light will disintegrate, rot, wither, and die, losing the vibrancy of life. Most of the attacks, aside from purification, are ineffective against the wearer of Twilight Mask, as though no one can kill a dead person. This Twilight Mask is extremely powerful, but it's extremely dangerous. Even if it's not doing anything, the people around it would suddenly die one after another for no reason. Therefore, it must have a proper sealing method. No matter who it is, once you put on this mask, you will hear the sharp shriek and howls that seem to come from deep within the underworld. This is a psyche attack that will drive people crazy and make them lose their minds. At the same time, as long as you wear this mask for more than 5 minutes, you will permanently become its slave. This sealed artifact is almost useless. Although it's powerful, it can only be sealed. Only a mighty existence like Mr. Fool can ignore its negative effects. Derek opened his mouth but didn't say a word. Colin Iliad did some recollecting and continued, the third item is called Life's Cane. It can control beyonder creatures with low intelligence and reduce their insanity for a short period of time. It can use incomplete spirits and various materials to complete the ultimate, alchemical life. This could create an ordinary human that can exist for a long time. It can also create different dolls that could be used for battle and various kinds of things. This includes stone golems, mud golems, and steel golems. Any living creature lashed by this cane would have an increased tendency towards madness and losing control. Their bodies would also have a certain chance of mutating, producing watermelons, mushrooms, and wheat. Of course, these things cannot be eaten, as they would result in contamination. As for the living beings touched by the cane's tip, they'll be healed no matter how seriously injured they are, other than those that have already lost control. This cane will fill the surrounding areas with a vibrant life force. Be it plants or animals, it can grow with exuberance and reproduce rapidly. Unfortunately, it is useless against this land that is cursed. The person carrying Life's Cane has a high chance of mutating. The longer one holds it, the higher the odds. This will result in additional organs, or even them having missing body parts, being replaced by various plants. Sounds very sinister. For some reason, Derek felt a little horrified. Finally, he couldn't help but ask, "What's the fourth sealed artifact?" "It's from a demon which lost control. I hunted it and called it Fallen Flute. This is a plain-looking silver flute. However, once someone blows it, the living around it will fall into an unavoidable illusion. Their anger, sorrow, pain, greed, vanity, arrogance, and other desires would rapidly swell. Some would have their mind explode, others lose their sanity or experience a loss of control. Being in the vicinity of fallen flute, all sentient beings, other than the wielder, will significantly have their mental facilities deteriorate and will easily make mistakes. At the same time, the wielder of the flute is exceptionally sensitive to danger. Sometimes, they can even predict the possibility of a threat to their lives 1 to 2 days early. Wherever this fallen flute is, one's humanity will gradually degenerate, and all kinds of desires will enter center stage as their beliefs are cast aside. The wielder will also turn cold and be unable to have normal emotions again. The more they use it and the more they carry it, the worse it will be. And this might result in conflict with their own pathways acting, leading to an increased risk of losing control. After introducing the fourth sealed artifact, Colin Iliad's light blue eyes, which seemed to be filled with stories, looked at Derek and asked, "What do you think?" "I need some time to consider," Derek replied rather skillfully. "Indeed, this is really important to you. You can't rashly make a decision." Colin nodded. 3 days later, we will set off for the afternoon town camp. Tell me your answer before we set off, and reserve some time to familiarize yourself with the sealed artifact." "Yes, Your Excellency." Derek bowed seriously and left the chief's room. He wasn't in a rush to return home to pray to Mr. Fool. Instead, he planned on heading to the training field first to temper his various sun-domain theurgical spells. This was a habit engraved deep within the pulses of every single person in the City of Silver. Only a self-disciplined person who could endure hardship was able to live longer in these desolate and dark lands. In a dark alley in the Backlund Bridge area, Xiao once again met the golden-masked MI9 member who clearly showed kindness to her. The judge potion formula might take some time, the golden-masked man said. This was because, although the investigation into Xiao didn't continue, it didn't end. Xiao pursed her lips and nodded, as though she had finally made up her mind. "I don't want that formula anymore." "You gave up?" The golden-masked man was surprised and couldn't hide his joy. Xiao didn't directly answer as she turned her head to the side and said, I'll exchange all my contributions for cash." After hearing her answer, the golden-masked man nodded in relief. "It's best that you understand. Let bygones be bygones. You, your mother, and brother will have a brand new future. Yes, if your contributions are exchanged for cash, it'll be about 2,000 pounds. I'll help you gain more. After that, you can continue being an outer circle member of MI9. Having an official status is very useful for unaffiliated Beyonders." Xiao was silent for a few seconds before her lips quivered. "Thank you." She could clearly sense the kindness coming from the man in front of her, so she sincerely thanked him. However, there was no way she was giving up. The reason why she chose cash was because she had already reserved the judge potion formula from the world Gehrman Sparrow. The crazy adventurer had also claimed that the disciplinary paladin potion formula would subsequently follow. At the same time, giving up on the surface could effectively dispel the suspicions of MI9. After briefly explaining the progress of the previous commissions, Xiao bade farewell to the golden-masked man and left the alley. On Tuesday morning, Furs went out early and came to the Hat Trick Inn in Sherwood Borough where she met her teacher, Dorian Gray. This is one of the things to take note of in the spirit world. This is a portrait of Bodhi's. Dorian covered his mouth and yawned before handing a thick stack of paper to Furs. Furs wasn't in a rush to read the documents as she cast her gaze at the portrait. On it was a black-robed man who likely wasn't even 40. His brown hair was slightly curled, but it gave off an unusually firm feeling. His dark eyes seemed to contain countless objects. This is the Saint of Secrets. Furs rubbed her fingers together and used her trickmaster powers to burn that portrait. Not bad. Very cautious. Dorian nodded approvingly. He then carried his suitcase and said to Furs, I have to return to Pritz Harbor. It will arouse suspicion if I come to Backlund for too long. Furs knew that the situation in Backlund had been tense recently, so she was eager for her teacher to leave as soon as possible, therefore, she didn't hold him back and watched him leave the room. Then, with the help of door opening, she walked all the way to the alley behind the hotel. Just as she got her bearings and turned into a street, she suddenly saw a man in a black trench coat walking over. The person swept a glance at her before looking away naturally. However, Firz's back muscles tensed up. Her eyes reflected the other person's appearance, a man who likely wasn't even 40. His brown hair was slightly curled, but it gave off an unusually firm feeling. His dark eyes seemed to contain countless objects. Chapter 1078 The Hidden Seeker Saint of Secrets Bodhis. Furs had experienced many things recently, to the point of being watched by a king of angels, so she didn't show any signs of abnormality. She retracted her gaze in a natural manner and didn't slow down her pace as she walked towards the man in the black trench coat. After a few steps, they brushed past each other. Did he happen to pass by here because of the attraction between beyonder characteristics? If he knew that teacher was here, he wouldn't be so slow and would use teleport to chase after him. Luckily, teacher has already boarded the carriage and left the inn. Firz's heart calmed down, her tense mind relaxing a little. She took a few more steps forward and looked up at the sky. She wanted to confirm if it would rain later. At this moment, a raven flew over and landed on a tree along the way. It faced the spot where Furs had just passed by. Furs stopped thinking about Saint of Secrets Bodhis as she maintained her speed and left the street. As the Aurora Order hadn't held a gathering in Backlund for a long period of time, and with the target being a demigod, Furs didn't have any thoughts of seeking revenge for her teacher. Ignoring her lack of combat strength, just finding and locking onto a secret sorcerer was a nearly impossible task. It's best that I wait till I become a traveler. I might encounter Bodhis by chance before entrusting Mr. World the corresponding mission. I'll take the time to save up money. Now, it's certain that the Aurora Order has saints in Backlund. I can't eliminate the possibility that during Bodhis's travel elsewhere today, he was influenced by the attraction force of beyonder characteristic and had accidentally lost his way in Backlund. Furs very naturally considered looking for the World Gehrman Sparrow's help. From what she knew, this gentleman had killed 2 demigods with his own hands, and he had only become a demigod for 3 months. In the upper echelons of the 7 churches, they only have about 10 demigods. Based on Mr. World's progress, it will take him at most 2 years to wipe out the powerhouses of a church. Of course, the real world isn't an ideal measurement. Having received higher education, Furs, who had been a surgeon, gradually let her thoughts wander. She walked to the street and boarded a rental carriage. Above the grey fog, there was a mini-gathering with the son Derek, the hanged man Alger, and the World Gehrman Sparrow. However, unlike before, Mr. Fool was present as the witness because the son's main motive was to find out which sealed artifact could please this great existence, as well as to exchange it for the cross left behind by the Creator. At the same time, he still had some questions to consult Mr. Hanged Man and Mr. World about, so he had applied for a private exchange. Sword of Silver Dawn, Twilight Mask, Life's Cane, Fallen Flute. These were all items that have outstanding powers and negative effects, ones that require sealing. This also confirms that the City of Silver doesn't have any beyonders from the artisan pathway. All the spoils can only be formed naturally. Even with a godlike sealed artifact, they can shatter the characteristics, but they are unable to reform them in a better way. As the fool Klein listened to Little Son's description, he quickly analyzed the pros and cons of different sealed artifacts in his mind. The first thing he did was eliminate the Twilight Mask because the negative effects of the sealed artifact from the City of Silver's first chief were too great. Although Klein could let his marionette wear this mask and cut off the oral senses, thus, avoiding the continuous howls and screams. Furthermore, he didn't have to worry about his marionette becoming a slave to the Twilight Mask. However, In that case, his actual body might become a member of the dead who died suddenly for no reason. Following that, Klein similarly gave up the fallen flute for the same reasons. This sealed artifact's ability to predict danger ahead of time was indeed better than the desire apostle in Creeping Hunger. It was alluring, but the negative effects were also not easy to avoid. If Klein used this flute with his actual body, he would gradually turn cold and lose his normal emotions. This would be completely contradictory with the concept of using humanity to battle godhood to maintain balance. And if he were to hand it over to his marionette, he would experience a significant decrease in his mental facilities and easily make mistakes. This caused him to lose his main advantage as a beyonder of the seer pathway. In addition, this flute will make the people around it give themselves up to degeneration and desires. I don't want the residents on Buklun Street to be degenerates who give up on their morals. By then, how many illegitimate children will be BOM? I can only consider the Sword of Silver Dawn and Life's Cane. Klein mumbled silently before quickly choosing between two. The Sword of Silver Dawn's head engraving seemed to have a living characteristic. To Klein, this meant that communication was possible, and as long as they could communicate, the negative effects could naturally be reduced. As for the height restriction, he could just ignore his thickness and only focus on his height. After all, this didn't affect a clown due to its extremely high sense of balance. Regarding the problem of mutation with Life's Cane, he could avoid it by handing it to his marionettes. When he lost or gained any organs, he could heal himself with Flower of Blood. And causing the surroundings to be filled with vitality, allowing for lush growth wasn't much of a negative effect. Since the negative effects of the two sealed artifacts weren't too serious, he had to consider their effects. The Sword of Silver Dawn was clearly from a demon hunter of the warrior pathway. Be it attacks or defense, they were both potent. It could hide his malintent and be good at dealing with devils. As for Life's Cane, it was good at creating and causing mutations, which made it rather sinister. After a few seconds of consideration, when Derek asked for the answer, the fool Klein spoke unhurriedly, as though he was discussing something ordinary. The cane. In the end, he decided on Life's Cane. In fact, the Sword of Silver Dawn and Life's Cane had their own pros, making it a tough decision. Klein's final decision stemmed from an uncommon reason. The sinister Life's Cane could be described as bizarre, so it could effectively aid him in acting as a bizarro sorcerer and raise his potion digestion speed. Yes, Mr. Fool. Derek replied, unable to hide his joy. This meant that when he completed the sacrificial and bestowment ritual, he would obtain the cross from the Creator. After determining this, he cast his gaze at the figure at the bottom of the long bronze table. Mr. World, other than the complete brain of an adult mind dragon, do you still need a relatively high sequence potion formula for the plantar pathway? As the secret passage of the Giant King's court was shared by the world, he became the target of Derek's question, and not Mr. Fool. Of course, to Derek, the world was Mr. Fool's blessed. His answer represented Mr. Fool's intentions to a certain extent. A relatively high sequence potion formula for the plantar pathway. Sitting at the end of the long bronze table, the fool Klein immediately had a headache and fell into an intense internal struggle. He could roughly understand what the chief of the City of Silver's thought process was. On the one hand, this experienced demon hunter hopes that he can usher in a bright future through the Giant King's court's exploration, while on the other hand, he's still cautious and doesn't hold much hope. He's prepared to continue staying in the darkness, so he mentioned the plantar potion formula to see if Mr. Fool has the corresponding authority, or rather, does the faction that he watches over have a need for it. If this could bring about certain feedback, it would effectively improve the survival of the City of Silver. Meanwhile, on Klein's end, Frank Lee had recently come to believe that he's just one step away from his research goals. When he becomes a druid, he should be able to succeed. This made Klein very hesitant on whether he should give him a push. I don't know what the future holds. I'll just focus on what's in front of me. A Sequence 5 Beyonder who doesn't even have godhood wouldn't be able to do anything too serious. Furthermore, Ma'am Hermit is already a demigod. It's not a big problem for her to watch out for Frank. Klein thought for a moment and let the World Gehrman Sparrow say, Sequence 5. What if there's more? Derek pressed. Klein felt like he was being tested. After a few seconds of silence, he said, if your side is willing to give it, then that works, all right. Derek didn't probe any further. Instead, he asked the person beside him, Mr. Hanged Man, I have a strange feeling about this. Why did the chief suddenly mention the relatively high sequence potion formula of the plantar pathway? The Hanged Man Alger looked at the World Gehrman Sparrow and said, this should be a test from your chief, to see if the City of Silver can change its environment. I remember you mentioning that you only know that the goddess of harvest is the giant king's queen, and according to the records of the Sanguine from the moon, the goddess of harvest is named Omabella. Your City of Silver originally believed in her. I was originally only certain that the name Omabella was real, so I didn't have any inclination towards other explanations. Now, with your chief suddenly taking out a relatively high sequence potion formula that you didn't know before, this makes me suspect that the moon is right. This means that your City of Silver hid the fact that they once believed in the goddess of harvest. They even deliberately didn't mention her true name. There must be a huge secret behind this. A huge secret, Derek thought seriously but couldn't think of any secret. Fortunately, this wasn't an important matter to him. He quickly ended the private conversation and returned to the City of Silver to prepare for the exchange of sealed artifacts. Chapter 1079 The hard-working gardeners above the grey fog. Klein, who was sitting at the fool's seat, beckoned for the unshadowed crucifix. The bronze cross was tied together with an ordinary-looking button, and the surface of the latter was already covered with a layer of crystalline but heavy-feeling particles. This was the Hermit Catlia's Judge button. It was reserved for Judgment Zio at a price of £3,500. Therefore, Admiral of Stars had sacrificed it to Mr. Fool in advance, requesting the mighty existence to get an angel under him to shatter it. And on Monday's tarot gathering, Zio had made a reservation for the Judge potion formula at a price of £2,000. According to their agreement, Justice Audrey wasn't to share anything they obtained from exploring Grozel's travels, other than knowledge. She was only providing free help for the world-killing Vin Rambus. As for the Star Leonard, he had the right to sell the potion formulas and historical knowledge, but obviously, Judgment Zio trusted the World Gehrman Sparrow more. The purging should be almost done. This way, I can trade the unshadowed crucifix with Little Sun without any worries. In the future, if there are other similar requests, they'll definitely be more willing to trade with Little Sun, instead of asking Mr. Fool for help. No one will dare frequently disturb a hidden existence, unless there's really no other way. When Little Sun has the chance to become a demigod and transform the unshadowed crucifix into a special characteristic, should be a Sequence 3. I'll be able to use the power of this mysterious space above the grey fog to shatter sealed artifacts. After the disinfection process of the grey fog, Adam probably wouldn't be able to rely on the unshadowed crucifix to lock onto Little Sunday. However, even if he were able to find it through this, it wouldn't be too serious. His brother, Amon, knew long ago that Little Sun is related to Mr. Fool. Yes, it seems that Amon can freely enter and leave the forsaken land of the gods. I wonder if that's also the case for Adam. As Klein separated the unshadowed crucifix from the button that had begun to praise the sun, he looked at the Beyonder characteristic that had been purged while waiting for Little Sun to hold a sacrificial and bestowment ceremony. The City of Silver, within the spire. Derek Berg had finished setting up the ritual. He watched as a black, mud-covered doll approached with a wooden cane which looked like nothing special, and he placed it on the altar. After a serious prayer and doing some work, the illusory sacrifice and bestowment door opened and took away Life's cane, leaving behind a bronze green and spiky cross. At the same time, the name of the cross suddenly appeared in Derek's mind, including information of its usage and its negative effects. He suppressed his excitement and first thanked Mr. Fool before ending the ritual. He walked to the front of the altar, picked up the unshadowed crucifix, and scrutinized it repeatedly. After tidying up, Derek left and went to a room opposite and knocked on the chief's door. "Come in." Colin Iliad's deep voice rang out. Derek turned the doorknob, pushed open the door, walked in, and openly revealed the bronze cross. "Your Excellency, this is the item left behind by the Lord I previously mentioned. It's called the unshadowed crucifix. The method is to let the spikes on it be stained with the blood of the holder." He had deliberately changed the term relic to the item left behind. The white-haired Colin had already cast his gaze over when Derek took out the ancient cross. After listening to the introduction, he walked towards it with heavy steps. He took the item and kept examining it. Finally, Colin Iliad placed his thumb on a thorn and allowed fresh blood to flow out. The mottled bronze green started to peel away as the unshadowed crucifix revealed a physical body formed from pure light, illuminating the entire room without any trace of darkness. After an indescribable sacred feeling filled the surrounding area, Colin released his fingers and sighed. This is indeed the Lord's item, although he was born in an era more than 2,000 years since the City of Silver was forsaken, making it impossible for them to sense the aura of God. This city still had quite a few things that were used to offer sacrifices to the Creator. Every time the black-faced grass was harvested, they would be taken out and used in the ritual. Through a comparison with these items, Colin Iliad could almost confirm the origins of the cross. Derek had wanted to give a response, but the heavy tone in the chief's words suddenly pressed down on his heart, preventing him from speaking. Colin Iliad didn't make any further comments and just stood there silently with the unshadowed crucifix in hand. After a few seconds, the City of Silver chief broke the silence and said with a slightly hoarse voice, "The return of the Lord's item is a sign. We shall welcome the sign of dawn. I will hold on to this unshadowed crucifix for half a day. I want to gather all the elders in the city to present this item to them. Heh, even I can't casually deal with a saint-level sealed artifact. Since I lost life's cane, I have to explain it to the other elders and request to be punished. You must remember that, as chief, you must have the courage to shoulder the corresponding responsibilities. You can't avoid punishment just because you think that it's good for the City of Silver. You might be right this time, but you can't guarantee that you're always right. Don't worry. This unshadowed crucifix will eventually return to you." The chief's words are deep and profound. I'll get Mr. Hanged Man to explain it to me at the next tarot gathering. Derek instinctively wanted to raise his right hand and scratch the back of his head, but in the end, he endured it and informed Colin Iliad of the negative effects of the unshadowed crucifix. Backlund North Borough, 160 Backlund Street. Klein sacrificed Winner and Nuni above the grey fog to ensure marionette preservation. This was to make it convenient for him to use him in the future. He planned on getting Earl of the Fallen Kona's Kilgore to wear the Flower of Blood ring and wield life's cane. In day-to-day life, he would create some harrowing and bizarre situations from time to time, helping him expedite the digestion of his potion. This way, Anuni had no way of using Flower of Blood to hide in Kona's Kilgore's stomach. He needed to hide in a more concealed manner, making it rather troublesome. Therefore, Klein decided to simply leave him above the grey fog. After all, Klein could create ordinary marionettes anytime he wanted. Why does the action of placing a marionette in a preservation cabinet to keep fresh feel odd? It's not like I'm acting in a horror movie. However, this does fit the name of Bizarro Sorcerer a bit. The angel from the Antigonus and Zeridal family all hang up their marionettes to wine dry, so I'm much better than them. After rubbing his chin, Klein stuffed the ordinary wood-colored cane into a specially made cane he bought through misjudgment. The cane was hollow, and it could be used to contain a sword that wasn't considered too wide. It was perfect for hiding life's cane. After he was done with this work, he allowed the servant who looked like Enuni, who was actually Kona's, to take away his cane and return to the room next door. He washed up himself before getting into bed. While sleeping soundly in a pleasant, relaxed state, Klein's spiritual perception suddenly stirred. He abruptly sat up and cast his gaze at the attached balcony. The curtains weren't fully drawn, and he could see the situation outside. It was dark green outside the window with vine leaves, and flowers were growing all over the place in layers. This made him suspect that he had been transported to the forest. The corners of his mouth twitched as he vaguely guessed what was going on. He rolled out of bed and walked to the balcony, drawing the curtains open. What entered his vision was no longer the garden in the residence of Dwayne Dantes. Instead, it was a lush forest. This is what it means to make the surrounding area become filled with a vibrant life force. Be it animals or plants, they're all flourishing and growing rapidly. Isn't this a little too fast? Klein's expression instantly turned a little blank. Previously, when he had divined that the life's cane's negative effects, he had seen similar scenes. However, the revelation he received was that it wasn't harmful to the surrounding area. Thus, he believed that the growing and proliferation process took a fairly long period of time and could be effectively controlled, allowing one to pay no attention to it for a very, very long time before seeing such a scene. With this thought in mind, he observed all the spirit-body threads in the surrounding area. He realized that humans weren't affected at all, but the number of rats and cockroaches was clearly increasing. This result made him heave a sigh of relief. He looked out of the window at the forest and sighed silently. Indeed, there isn't much danger. It's just quite exaggerated. I still have to keep it above the gray fog most of the time. More than 10 seconds later, figures appeared within the forest. Some of them were very thin, and others were thick. They all wore black trench coats, and their faces were very flat. They had no eyes, noses, and mouths. These figures were either crouching or standing, busy burning weeds, cutting the vines, and removing the unnecessary flowers in the quiet night. The next morning, Butler Walter woke up as usual and opened the window. The garden outside was bathed in the morning fog. There was some dew that gathered, emitting a fresh scent. Better than yesterday. Walter nodded slightly and praised the two gardeners. The vibrant scene made him feel a little restless as he began missing his wife for no apparent reason, so he left the room to patrol the estate and made arrangements for all sorts of affairs. Finally, he waited at the entrance of the dining room. Not long after, his employer, Dwayne Dantes, led his valet, Enuni, down from the third floor. Walter went forward to bow and talked about today's arrangements before taking the initiative to mention it. "Sir, I would like to take 1 day leave from the current month's allowance." As he spoke, he suddenly saw the mixed-blood servant's neck split open, revealing a black eye. Walter was shocked and nearly tumbled backward. But in the blink of an eye, he realized that there was no strange eye on Enuni's neck. "It must be because I didn't sleep well last night and had a strange dream, resulting in me being distracted and having hallucinations." Walter hurriedly gathered his thoughts and lowered his head slightly. In his heart, Klein apologized and nodded. "No problem. Have a wonderful day with your family." Chapter 1080 The line of thinking for acting. After watching Butler Walter leave the second floor, Klein entered the dining hall. As he looked around, he realized that the servants were much more energetic than usual. They even felt a little agitated. Indeed, life's cane also affects humans, but it's not that ridiculous. It's at a rather normal level and still within acceptable levels. According to this logic, the servants' reproduction abilities would definitely increase. The only problem is that they don't have spouses, so there's no way to show that. Will Mr. Butler's act of returning home today result in him having another child in 9 to 10 months? His wife is almost 40 years old. It's a little dangerous for her to have children at this age. Of course, as the other party in the copulation process, the effects of life's cane would pass over to them. There shouldn't be any problems. Man, I wonder if the potential effect will result in an increase in conceiving a child. If Dwayne Dantes' moving into Buckland Street causes one to have an increased chance of having children, my reputation will practically be doomed. Klein's thoughts drifted without end. Finally, he concluded in his mind, life's cane truly is very sinister. In the future, he would only bring it into the real world for some time each day and try his best not to affect the humans around him. After breakfast, Klein brought his valet, Enuni, to the first floor and prepared to take a stroll. At that moment, 2 chambermaids were cleaning in the main hall. "Good morning, sir." Upon seeing Dwayne Dantes approach, the 2 chambermaids immediately stood up, made way for him, and greeted him. Of course, if they were in a more remote comer, they would try their best not to make a sound, just in case they disturbed their employer. This was something they learned from Butler Walter's teachings. Klein nodded and gave a simple response as he slowly approached the door. At that moment, the 2 maids suddenly saw a wheat head embedded in Enuni's head. It was full of golden particles and was extremely attractive. Before they could even take a closer look, the valet seemed to have sensed something amiss. He raised his right hand and yanked off the piece of wheat using plenty of force. The 2 maids looked at each other in surprise and amusement. They imagined that Enuni had accidentally gotten some wheat on his body when he followed Mr. Dantes over to Mager Manor, bringing it all the way back to 160 Buckland Street, where they scattered in places that weren't easy to clean. For example, under the pillow he slept last night. In his dreams, he pushed the pillow away and ended up lodging a piece of wheat into his hair without realizing it when washing up in the morning and during breakfast. Although this process was complicated and not easily achieved, it was still possible. It can't be that Enuni grew a single wheat head, right? The 2 maids mumbled to themselves as they continued with their work. After exiting 160 Buckland Street, Klein and Enuni slowly walked with one behind the other under the withered Intis parasol trees, breathing in the fresh autumn air. Like him, a number of neighbors were taking a morning stroll. Of course, this wasn't a habit belonging to those amongst Buckland's high society. Last year, the smog was very serious, and the air was quite pungent. No one was willing to waste their time in the streets, braving the cold wind and the humidity. As a neighbor, since they had met each other, there was no doubt that they would greet each other. When they walked past each other, one of the lawyers glanced at Dwayne Dantes' valet from the corner of his eye. He had raised his hand to cover his mouth as if he was yawning. When the mixed-blood youth put down his right hand, the lawyer suddenly realized something was different. His nose seems to be even higher. I must have been thinking too much about such matters, causing me to hallucinate. If only my nose was slightly higher. As the lawyer thought about it, he raised his hand and rubbed his nose. At the same time, he saw 2 wild dogs engaged in a chase in front of him, attempting to reproduce on the street. After the stroll, Klein returned to the activity room on the 3rd floor and sent life's cane above the gray fog. Indeed, there's a certain effect. The main point of the Bizarro Sorcerer's digestion is actually to create shocking scenes to scare people, as well as use a strange method to make people horrified. This really does resemble a director, but it's just a horror flick's director. Yes, I don't have to really scare them. Peaceful daily life events contain terrifying scenes, but the surrounding humans don't notice them at all. They only occasionally made the connection, and when they think about it, they would feel a sense of fear from certain possibilities, to the point of not daring to turn off the lights and ending up having nightmares. That's also a horror film archetype. As Klein observed his condition, he summarized his experiences over the past few months and finally summed it all up with the keyword, horror film director. After understanding this, he had many ideas on how to quickly digest the potion. Not only did he have to deal with enemies, but he also had to turn his enemies into the main characters or important supporting roles in a horror film. This will be quite troublesome. I definitely have to give my all to the targets at the demigod level. I wouldn't be in the mood to waste my time and effort on pulling some tricks. Well, there's no need to find a demigod target. There's no restriction for acting like this. I can teleport to the sea and find some lucky pirates to participate, creating some horror stories. That's right. Since I'm a director, I have to let my works spread. It seems like I have to let some of the actors escape successfully every time and spread the nightmare that they experienced, creating a corresponding myth at sea. I can't feed them to creeping hunger. As he formed his plan, Klein suddenly thought of a question. In the horrifying legends of the people in the northern continent and the sea, how many of them were deliberately created by bizarro sorcerers? There must be some. If Amon were to act as a bizarro sorcerer, he would probably be able to digest the potion in less than a month. His talent in this aspect is astounding, and he doesn't consider the consequences. In truth, while looking for pirates to film the horror movie, I can find an opportunity to scare other demigods. I don't have to fight them to the death. Once my goal is accomplished, I can escape. With this thought in mind, Klein came up with a plan for the supporting role. Hence, he carefully considered his targets. There's no way I can find an angel or higher. Those who I'm not familiar with will make me the leading character of a horror movie on the spot. Those who are familiar with me are well aware that I'm a bizarro sorcerer, so there's no way to scare them. There are many saints that I have no idea about their whereabouts. Frightening the archbishops will easily cause unnecessary chain reactions, causing the world situation to become even more tense and for the war to erupt premature. After eliminating all the possibilities, the most suitable target is the numinous episcopate's artificial death faction's demigod, Patrick Bryan, as well as the counselors of Will Septon's Fate Council, as well. After creating a name list, Klein decided to take some time over the next 2 days to visit Dr. Aaron Series. He wanted to bring some ice cream for a certain baby to ask where the counselors were recently seen. If he wanted to frighten someone else's subordinates, he had to get the approval of the president. Klein was in a good mood after organizing his thoughts. He went out again and went to St. Samuel Cathedral to pray and donate before heading to the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation, where he stayed till noon. In the afternoon, he saw a few businessmen and professional lawyers and accountants who were seeking investments, behaving like a normal tycoon. After filling his stomach, he returned to the half-opened room with the balcony. Just as he was considering whether to visit Dr. Aaron Series' house directly tomorrow, or invite their family to have a nice dinner at the Srenzo restaurant which served excellent ice cream, his spiritual perception was triggered. He turned his head and, without any surprise, saw Miss Messenger walk out of the void with 4 blonde, red-eyed heads. One of the heads bit on a letter. Who sent it? Klein habitually and expectantly asked. As he had yet to receive the letter, Rionette Tynker could only answer with 3 heads. King of Idiots, Patrick Bryan? This nickname has even evolved? Klein reached out and took the letter. When he opened it, he realized that it was indeed from the Artificial Death Faction's demigod. He wrote on the letter, "I've already prepared the special ritual that will help my teacher, Hater, recover further. Your Excellency, I will hold it tomorrow at midnight given your permission, the ritual that points towards the angel, Hater. There's no way to avoid the numinous episcopate's Artificial Death Faction's testing of Patrick. This can be interfered with using Paper Angel." Just in time. With a flick of his wrist, Klein burned the letter. Following that, he took out a piece of paper and wrote down an answer, "Yes, you may. You must be careful." In the quiet night, near midnight, in an uninhabited clothes factory in St. George Borough, there was an open area that had been cleared. Nearly 10 black-robed figures were standing there. In the middle of them was a deep black coffin that looked rather heavy. Around the coffin were many golden ornaments with mud stains. There were many candles flickering with pale white flames, as well as one skull after another. The hideous white skulls belonged to humans, others from animals. Some were extremely strange and had a deformed look to it. It was hard to imagine their original appearance. The skulls were piled the highest up at the front, with Patrick Bryan standing there. He had also changed into a black robe, but he didn't pull up his hood, revealing a deep outline. He had black hair, brown eyes, and a rather long face. This demigod hadn't done anything, but his surroundings had turned extremely cold, as though countless invisible creatures were celebrating. As Patrick Bryan raised his right hand, the hooded believers jumped up and twitched a little. It was a crazy and rhythmic dance. This was a spirit dance, a ritual that death loved. The stronger the spirituality of the dancers, the better the effects. As the dance became more intense, a cold and formless wind blew out from the coffin. Patrick Bryan lowered his head and recited in a language that seemed to come from the underworld, the king from the depths of hell, an angel playing the music of death, the ruler above river Styx. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.